All right, the next one here. The U.S. will increase its military presence in the Persian Gulf. So this is another one from Kyle. And National Security Council spokesman John Kirby announced a plan to expand America's military posture in the Middle East. And the move comes after the U.S. hijacked an Iranian fuel tanker, prompting Iran to seize 2 ships in the Persian Gulf. So Kirby told reporters on Friday, quote, "Today, the Department of Defense will be making a series of moves to bolster our defensive positions in the Persian Gulf. U.S. Central Command will provide additional details on those reinforcements in the coming days," end quote. So the U.S. and Iran began seizing commercial vessels in recent weeks. In April, Washington seized the Suez Rajan, which is a tanker carrying Iranian oil to China. 5 days later, Iran confiscated a U.S.-bound Marshall Islands flagged oil tanker. And then a few days after that, they seized a second ship in the Gulf. So tensions between the U.S. and Iran, it's something that's easy to forget about with all this stuff going on with Ukraine and Russia and China. But the situation in the Middle East between the U.S. and Iran is not good and can really escalate at any time here, especially now with the U.S. sending more military assets to the region. So the ceasefire ends 5 days of Gaza escalation. So it looks like the situation in Gaza has finally wound down. So Israel and the Islamic Jihad in Gaza agreed to a ceasefire late Saturday evening, bringing to a tentative end 5 days of intense cross-boundary fire that claimed the lives of 33 Palestinians in Gaza and 2 people in Israel. Palestinians across Gaza celebrated in the streets upon the declaration of the Egyptian-mediated ceasefire.
A tree branch hung in the open window. The leaves moved against the sky, implying sun and summer and an inexhaustible earth to be used. Dominique thought of the world as background. Wynand thought of 2 hands bending a tree branch to explain the meaning of life. The leaves drooped, touching the spires of New York's skyline far across the river. The skyscrapers stood like shafts of sunlight, washed white by distance and summer. A crowd filled the county courtroom, witnessing the trial of Howard Rourke.
Blinken, on the other hand, is doing just the opposite. He's meeting with the British foreign minister. And what are the Brits doing? They're supplying the red line type equipment that can reach 150 miles. 150 miles, that's a red line, okay? And they're also, and this is really disgusting.
Wait, what do you mean when you say red line? Meaning 150 miles into Moscow, which would be crossing a red line in Putin's mind.
Yeah, the Russians have made it clear that if you put offensive missiles in Ukraine, they go more than the ones that we have now, which are about 60 miles, so the Himars, okay? That is a red line, because that could reach not only Moscow, but some of the ICBM force in Western Russia. So this is serious stuff. So what do the Brits do? They not only supply that kind of thing weeks ago, since they already used them 2 days ago, okay, to hit where? Luhansk, the city of Luhansk, where there's no really military formations. It's against civilians in Luhansk. It's almost as though they're trying to provoke the Russians.
Rourke sat at the defense table. He listened calmly. Dominique sat in the third row of spectators. Looking at her, people felt as if they had seen a smile. She did not smile. She looked at the leaves in the window. Gail Wynand sat at the back of the courtroom. He had come in alone when the room was full. He had not noticed the stairs and the flashbulbs exploding around him. He had stood in the aisle for a moment, surveying the place as if there were no reason why he should not survey it. He wore a gray summer suit and a Panama hat with a drooping brim turned up at one side. His glance went over Dominique, as over the rest of the courtroom. When he sat down, he looked at Rourke. From the moment of Wynand's entrance, Rourke's eyes kept returning to him. Whenever Rourke looked at him, Wynand turned away.
What's being taught and circulates surely in our schools is the critical race theory, and they preach this. They preach racism, and if you don't, you can't move ahead. And sometimes you can't pass your courses. If you challenge the professor on critical race theory. But the whole thing is they want you to abide by their rules because they say that it's the white supremacy and the racism, and then we have to just stop this. But how do they describe what they want? They want They want more diversity.
Yeah.
Diversity according to their rules and regulations and according to their guns that you point at you. And they want equity. What does that mean? Equity sounds pretty good. Equality of justice might be one thing, but this equity is economic redistribution of wealth by force, by guns. And then they also want inclusion. And you already pointed out that Biden promises inclusion, but it got worse, and it's worse so long. So and what is the opposition to that? What would we support in opposition to that? And for me, I describe it as individualism. Rights come to individuals, not to groups, and individualism means that you can be diverse. I think really the best diversity is when an individual has a right to his own life, and that they can do what they want as long, by one rule: you can't hurt people. But they don't simplify this. They say, no, you have to obey the government. So whether it's in a medical treatment of COVID or whether it's what you do at school and all the things, they want to do that and set the standards. And they are the authoritarians. They rely on authoritarianism, where I think a libertarian society relies on individualism and a voluntary society. And I don't know how people can turn that down, especially if you can show the documentation that country or that part of the world that ever follows those rules like we did in our early history is so far superior. But people will find things because nothing is perfect. They'll say, right now, the left says that what they're after now is to destroy what we have because we're sick and tired of capitalism. That is such a distorted figure because we are pretty critical, on the type of capitalism, this crony capitalism. But that isn't it. They just have a theory of government that leads to this divisiveness and the racism that comes because you have to compete for your share of the loot.
So there's no foreign policy success, no economic success. So he could never ask the question, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? But the answer is resoundingly no. So what do you do in that case? You ramp up fear because that's all he has left. Fear, hatred, and divisiveness is all they have left. It just does remind me of their approach, and it is such a divisive approach because remember the first thing they had to put their hooks in was January 6th. We had an insurrection. There's a terrorist threat in the U.S. There's the insurrection of Trump voters. Then of course the entire Russia collusion. Russia's behind everything we don't like. Russia's deep in stealing our bodily fluids. It's the same selling of fear, over and over again, and that's what it seems like they're basing the campaign on, is just selling this fear and dividing people,
Well, you can use that statement very generally, too. You have to scare the people if you want them to go and send their kids off to fight a senseless, stupid war that's illegal, unconstitutional, and has no purpose. So you have to scare the people, and that is their goal. And unfortunately, there is a mob psychology. It's very catchy. So the contest is between who controls the scenario, who controls the propaganda.
You remember back when they started the war on terrorism, George W. Bush, and once you call something terrorist, then of course anything is justified, to take that person or that thing or that idea out. When they declared a war on terrorism, I remember you said more than once, more than a few times, this is dangerous terminology because this war, okay, now it's just all these bad Muslims overseas, but this war will be turned in against Americans, and that's exactly what we're seeing here. Using that term, the other that has to be quashed because they're such a threat. Now it's I don't know, half of America he's talking about, I guess, according to his terminology.
There will be, a contest over more spending and less spending and how you spend it, but they reject outright the restraints put in the Constitution. So they've rejected, most everybody I met in Washington, they've rejected the principle of why the Constitution exists. And we were warned at the very beginning, it's not going to work if the people are a bunch of immoral rascals who are only looking for a free handout. But there was certainly enough thou shalt nots in the Constitution where the guideline is there and the purpose is there that everybody has heard before, and they still use it. It's such a great quote. It comes from Martin Luther King, who was anti-war. He didn't, manufacture that for political reasons, and he came out strongly against the Vietnam War, probably one of the major reasons why he got assassinated. But his quote at his great speech in Washington, he mentioned something, not that this meant that Martin Luther King was a libertarian, but on war issues and civil liberty issues, he was pretty darn good. Economics is where libertarians would find fault. But his quote is so famous, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Wonderful. And the liberals are right about this, and the liberals have to refute this. So that's what they're in the business on. And the liberal argument now is that they're misinterpreting Martin Luther King, and they want to reverse this. And what they want to say is he didn't really mean it. And this would be a pretty good example of trying to rewrite history but they could use it, and we could agree with something. Nobody's declared that he's 100% libertarian, and we have to change it. You don't have to change anything because it's right out in the open. But we do not suffer. And people who get imprisoned in Russia for a couple of days, sometimes they come home and they think America's not so bad because they realize that we still do have enough liberty. We have enough liberty if we will wake up and make use of that, because numbers do count. Numbers count. Not in the sense of the Democratic majority, the dictatorship of the majority, not that political thing that they talk about, by the majority of the people agreeing, that peace is far superior to war.
The motive which the state proposes to prove, the prosecutor was making his opening address to the jury, is beyond the realm of normal human emotions. To the majority of us, it will appear monstrous and inconceivable. Dominique sat with Mallory, Heller, Lansing, Enright, Mike, and Guy Francoeur, to the shocked disapproval of his friends. Across the aisle, celebrities formed a comet. From the small point of Ellsworth Toohey, well in front, a tail of popular names stretched through the crowd. Lois Cook, Gordon L. Prescott, Gus Webb, Lancelot Clokey, Ike, Jules Fogler, Sally Brent, Homer Slottern, Mitchell Layton. Even as the dynamite which swept a building away, his motive blasted all sense of humanity out of this man's soul. We are dealing, gentlemen of the jury, with the most vicious explosive on earth, the egotist.
I did read one report that said that Ukraine was already using these missiles, and so it could have been that London had been in the process of sending them to Ukraine for some time, and they finally reached the country, or they're finally used in battle, and London felt like, well, we better make sure it sounds like it was on our terms than everybody just finding out. So this could be a big deal, though. As we have talked about on the show, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has made it clear that the Kremlin's position is they are going to take territory in NATO, a territory in Ukraine that corresponds with the range of the weapons that NATO provides to Ukraine. And so if, say, you double the range of the munitions that you're sending Ukraine, then Russia is going to take twice the amount of territory. So the Kremlin called this news extremely negative and vowed to respond. This will demand an adequate response from our military, which will naturally, from a military point of view, find corresponding solutions, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said.
On the chairs, on the windowsills, in the aisles, pressed against the walls, the human mass was blended like a monolith, except for the pale ovals of faces. The faces stood out, separate, lonely, no two alike. Behind each there were the years of a life lived, or half over, effort, hope, and an attempt, honest or dishonest, but an attempt. It had left on all a single mark in common. On lips smiling with malice, on lips loose with renunciation, on lips tight with uncertain dignity. On all, the mark of suffering.
What happened over the weekend? Governor Abbott of Texas puts these people, not all of them, but hundreds, even thousands of them, 65,000 so far, in buses and sends the buses to New York. Are they kidnapped? They give them $20 gift certificates at McDonald's. The poor people are so hungry, they take the gift certificates. They use some of the food immediately. They eat some on the bus. They use some of the gift certificates when they arrive in New York. They get in New York. New York puts them in hotels. The city pays for it. Now the city of New York is shipping them to the suburbs. They're shipping them to an area called Rockland County and Orange County. If you know the geography, Rockland County and Orange County are immediately north of New Jersey. It's New York State, but it's immediately north of New Jersey. And because the city of New York is paying for the migrants to stay in hotels, and because the city of New York is paying the hotels more than the hotels charge the public that has been using the hotels has been booted out. So the Veterans Administration puts homeless veterans in there, but the city of New York pays more than the Veterans Department does. So the veterans are booted out. The city of New York pays more for ballrooms to put bunk beds in and cots for sleeping than do people who pay to rent the ballrooms for weddings. So they're booted out. So last minute, these hotels in Rockland and Orange County, New York, are being emptied by the owners of the hotels, people who've planned their weddings. Imagine your wedding day is being disrupted by this. It's not the fault of the migrants. It's the fault of the government that has become a public trough. kicking these people out of the hotels because the government pays more. You blame the hotels, they want to make more money. They're violating their contract with the Veterans Department. They're violating their contract with these young couples that are about to get married. I hope somebody takes us to court. I have friends who are judges in these counties. I'd be happy to testify as an expert witness, but that's the mess that these counties are in now. As we speak, the buses are traveling from New York City to the suburban counties. The hotels are being emptied, and the money, the cash, is being wired from the treasury of the city of New York, much of which comes from the federal government, much of which is borrowed because the feds are bankrupt. That money is being wired into the coffer of the owners of those hotels.
In this day and age, when the world is torn by gigantic problems, seeking an answer to questions that hold the survival of man in the balance, this man attached to such a vague intangible, such an inessential as his artistic opinions, sufficient importance to let it become his sole passion, and the motivation of a crime against society. The people had come to witness a sensational case, to see celebrities, to get material for conversation, to be seen, to kill time. They would return to unwanted jobs, unloved families, unchosen friends, to drawing rooms, evening clothes, cocktail glasses, and movies, to unadmitted pain, murdered hope, desire left unreached, left hanging silently over a path on which no step was taken, to days of effort not to think, not to say, to forget and give in and give up. But each of them had known some unforgotten moment, a morning when nothing had happened, a piece of music heard suddenly and never heard in the same way again, a stranger's face seen in a bus, a moment when each had known a different sense of living. And each remembered other moments, on a sleepless night, on an afternoon of steady rain, in a church, in an empty street at sunset, when each had wondered why there was so much suffering and ugliness in the world. They had not tried to find the answer, and they had gone on living as if no answer were necessary, but each had known a moment when, in lonely, naked honesty, he had felt the need of an answer.
The next one here is another one from the Libertarian Institute. This is from Connor Freeman. Poland to deploy Himars near the Russian border. So Poland has received its first shipment of the U.S.-made high-mobility artillery rocket systems, which are the Himars that the U.S. has been arming Ukraine with, and these are manufactured by Lockheed Martin. And Poland announced that they will deploy the launchers near the country's shared border with Kaliningrad, which is the Russian enclave in Europe between Poland and Lithuania. So, it's Russian territory. It's not like it's, it's like Alaska is to the United States. It's part of Russia. It's just not connected to the Russian mainland. So in March, the Polish Defense Ministry announced that they will be purchasing these Himars, and they're going to have a range of nearly 200 miles. So they're going to get the longer range munitions for them. They're going to be placed within 50 miles of the border with Kaliningrad. And again, that Russian enclave, Kaliningrad, it is sandwiched between two NATO members, Poland and Lithuania. The next one here. So this is a big report from Brown University's Costs of War Project. And they put out this report that says the indirect deaths in the post 9/11 wars number 3.6 to 3.7 million. And if you include the direct deaths, meaning people killed in violence, which is over 900,000, according to their count, the total goes up to 4.5 to 4.6 million. So 4.5 million people killed in post 9/11 war zones in countries that the U.S. waged war in after 9/11, basically, the terror wars as we know them. And this includes Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen.
A ruthless, arrogant egotist who wished to have his own way at any price. 12 men sat in the jury box. They listened, their faces attentive and emotionless. People had whispered that it was a tough-looking jury. There were 2 executives of industrial concerns, 2 engineers, a mathematician, a truck driver, a bricklayer, an electrician, a gardener, and 3 factory workers. The impaneling of the jury had taken some time. Rourke had challenged many talesmen. He had picked these 12. The prosecutor had agreed, telling himself that this was what happened when an amateur undertook to handle his own defense. A lawyer would have chosen the gentlest types, those most likely to respond to an appeal for mercy. Rourke had chosen the hardest faces.
Yeah. Well, you talk a lot about the CIA coup with regard to the JFK assassination, a coup against America. This really looks like a second coup against America launched by the FBI in collusion with the CIA and the Hillary Clinton campaign. I mean, the Durham Report is an absolute bombshell. People say, well, no one's gone to jail. Well, maybe not yet. Maybe someone will. Certainly someone should. But just as you always say, the truth getting out can be enough. And the truth is the FBI launched a campaign to investigate the ties between Trump and Russia, knowing full well at the time that there was zero evidence whatsoever of these ties. And they leaked to create suspicion that Trump is really working for that bad, evil Putin. Over and over, not only did they try to change the election results by doing that, but they also hobbled his presidency for 4 years. Because the more he denied it, the more they say, see, only someone who is guilty would deny it so much. You just admit it. And now we know it's all completely fake. That's, I mean, the most disturbing thing about this whole thing, Dr. Paul, is that there really is nothing to stop them from doing it again. You know, they'll talk about reforms and measures are put in place, and I'll show their statement in a second. But it's like once it's been so obviously crossed that line where the deep state, the secret state, gets to decide who's elected, you know, there's nothing to stop them from doing it ever again, every single time.
No, and those kind of people will do that because they either can blind themselves to it or they literally can't comprehend telling the truth. They certainly don't put any value on it. They don't feel like, well, you know, they don't agitate and say, Adam Schiff, do you think at nighttime he says, looks like we got caught. I shouldn't have done that.
Right.
He's wanting to be senator to really have power.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's a shame.
Well, here's what the FBI said, if we can put this next clip up. This is their reaction to the report. The conduct of 2016 and 2017 that Special Counsel Durham examined was the reason that current FBI leadership already implement dozens of corrective actions, which have been in place for some time. Had those reforms been in place in 2016, the missteps identified in the report could have been prevented. This report reinforces the importance of ensuring the FBI continues to do its work with the rigor, objectivity, and professionalism the American people deserve and rightly respect. In a short way of saying this, we investigated ourselves and found out we're fine. We just needed to do a little reform. Here's Turley's take. It's on the FBI statement, if you can do that next one, because he makes a very, very good point. He says missteps is hardly how one would describe a false narrative promulgated by a campaign and perpetuated by the FBI, or the derailing of a duly elected president for 3 years in a faux conspiracy. The statement is ample evidence of a lack of remorse by the FBI, like a habitual offender giving a shrug in his court allocution before a judge. And that is a great point. Just saying this, it was a misstep, it's a misstep, we fixed it, no problem. That's nowhere near the level of remorse that we need to see. If this was a coup, this was a deep state coup against America, against every single American citizen. If you can put this next one on, this is a tweet by Greg Price, but he captures it. And every time I read this, I'm still astonished. I can't believe what I'm reading, but he has the documents to show it. According to the Durham Report, the plan by Hillary Clinton to create a false story linking Trump to Russia was briefed in August 2016 by CIA Director John Brennan to President Obama, Vice President Biden, Attorney General Lynch, and FBI Director Comey. They all knew about it. They were all in on it. They knew that Hillary was going to falsely claim that Trump was tied to Russia, and they all went along with it anyway. It's incredible. And not only that, but they encourage, if you look at this next one, here's Comey. The Carter Page files, and this is a long story, you don't want to get into the weeds too much, but this is where they surveilled members of the Trump campaign based on no material, no evidence. The Carter Page FISA was submitted under intense pressure from the FBI leadership. FBI Director James Comey in particular wanted the Carter Page FISA badly. He wrote to McCabe, "Where is the FISA? Where is the FISA?" Meaning he wanted the campaign people followed, wiretapped, bugged. He was looking, he was fishing. And he was also violating the Constitution and violating FISA itself.
You know, Brendan and the others who went along with this, their motivation was obviously that if they could control the judicial system, they're home free. And but they were overconfident, overstretched, and the whole thing is. And fortunately, they were caught. Unfortunately, it doesn't change a whole lot.
Had it been some plutocrat's mansion, but a housing project, gentlemen of the jury, a housing project. The judge sat erect on the tall bench. He had gray hair and the stern face of an army officer. A man trained to serve society, a builder who became a destroyer. The voice went on, practiced and confident. The faces filling the room listened with the response they granted to a good weekday dinner, satisfying and to be forgotten within an hour. They agreed with every sentence. They had heard it before. They had always heard it. This was what the world lived by. It was self-evident, like a puddle before one's feet.
And then the part that bothers me the most about this whole entire trial against them is the fact that the judge, in my opinion, changed the definition of seditious conspiracy. Traditionally, when it's been used against people in the Civil War to try to overthrow the government. You know, 'cause that's what was happening with the South. And
well, they weren't trying to overthrow. They weren't trying to install Jefferson Davis in Washington, D.C., though, just to be clear.
They were trying to secede. You're right. They're actually just technically trying to secede. But what I think the problem is this judge tried to change the definition and say it just means to interfere with government. And if you see what a scary, frightening precedent that sets, interfere with government. I mean, look at all the different types of protests we have across the country. People protesting COVID-19 restrictions. That could now fall under seditious conspiracy because you're trying to interfere with government.
Well, I haven't seen anything that's in these text messages. It is possible that there could be things in text messages that indicate conspiratorial behavior and behavior anticipating the use of violence. So was there, in fact, anything like that in the text messages?
Right. That's the crazy thing. There wasn't any. And even like the New York Times and these other mainstream media articles admit that there was nothing in there. In fact, when one Proud Boy suggested that they should storm the Capitol, the leader dismissed the idea. So the fishing expedition didn't even come up with anything. But the fact that some of the text messages had been deleted, so the prosecutors were not able to look at them, apparently the jurors said later that that is what helped convince them, well, we don't know what was in those deleted text messages. So, we're just going to convict based on what might have been in those text messages to get involved defending what they did, which is obviously, a little more serious than what he did, forcibly or getting into the Capitol the way they did is going to be considered worse than him saying stand back and stand by. So he can't even jump in and do anything. He has to just sit there and watch them take out person after person. And I believe they're just going to set this precedent with the Proud Boys. And then they're going to start coming after the rest of us who are less likely to engage in violence. But once you've already set that precedent, it can be construed so broadly that you can ensnare totally peaceful people like myself. Let's say I show up at some politician's home to interview him. They're going to say, okay, now Rachel's engaging in insurrection because she's interfering with his politician's ability to conduct his business. You see where this is all going? And the 65 Project retweeted my quote without any commentary. So it's like they're not even denying that they are specifically formed to disbar conservative firms.
I don't know that there's anything like that on the other side, because I think, in a way, conservatives are kind of fighting with one hand tied behind their backs in the sense that they still kind of have this nostalgic sense of an America in which, yeah, we had some divisions, but when it came right down to it, we were all Americans and this, and they still kind of feel like that's still in play. And it's not. To the contrary, there's a low-intensity civil war going on in the country, but one side is almost unilaterally disarmed because it's sitting around talking about impartial legal principles while the other side is beating it over the head and bludgeoning it and using every dirty trick in the book. It's a very, very hard situation, frankly, for normal people to navigate.
You bring up a really good point. And why isn't there an equivalent organization on the right? Well, let's think about it. That equivalent organization on the right would seek to get left-wing attorneys disbarred solely because they are left-wing attorneys. And I can't philosophically justify that in my mind. I understand that a lot of Saul Alinsky tactics really work, ridiculing your opponent, making fun of them. Yes. Do they work and do we use them? Yes. I use the ridicule one all the time at trolls on Twitter. But to me, it's just a step too far to just disbar somebody because they're politically on the left.
Well, so the situation we face, though, is, I'm sure you saw what happened at the law school at Stanford a month or two ago when Judge, I think Kyle Duncan showed up to speak and they didn't let him speak and they heckled him. And then he asked for an administrator to intervene, and he got an administrator, all right. He got the DEI dean, who basically stood up there and scolded him for dividing us by having all these unapproved opinions. How dare you have opinions that the New York Times hasn't approved for you? And you've got in that room, think about all those future judges, or lawyers, I beg your pardon, but some of them might be judges, who can't even sit quietly and listen to an opposing opinion. And instead, they have to shout the bearer of that opinion down. It seems like the legal profession is going down a very, very dangerous road, and I don't know what we can do about it.
The prosecutor introduced his witnesses. The policeman who had arrested Rourke took the stand to tell how he had found the defendant standing by the electric plunger. The night watchman related how he had been sent away from the scene. His testimony was brief. The prosecutor preferred not to stress the subject of Dominique. The contractor's superintendent testified about the dynamite missing from the stores on the site. Officials of Cortland, building inspectors, estimators, took the stand to describe the building and the extent of the damage. This concluded the first day of the trial.
This one here, Russia hits a U.S.-made Patriot system in Kiev. So Russia's military said Tuesday that it hit a U.S.-made Patriot air defense system in the Ukrainian capital with a hypersonic missile, and this was later confirmed by a U.S. official. A Russian defense ministry spokesman said that a high-precision strike by a Russian Kinzhal hypersonic missile hit one of these Patriots. And a U.S. official told CNN that a Patriot system in Kiev was likely damaged but not destroyed by a Russian missile barrage. The U.S. is assessing the damage to see if the system needs to be taken out of Ukraine for repairs. And the Patriot is one of the U.S.'s most advanced air defense systems. U.S. and Ukrainian officials have previously claimed that the Patriot systems intercepted Russian hypersonic missiles, and they said they intercepted more of these hypersonic missiles on Tuesday during this missile barrage. The Russian military has denied this. U.S. officials suggested to CNN that the Patriot might be more vulnerable to Russian attacks than other air defense systems. The CNN report reads, quote, unlike some shorter range air defenses provided to Ukraine that are mobile and harder to target, the large Patriot battery is a larger and more stationary system, making it possible for the Russian forces to zero in on the location over time, end quote.
Peter Keating was the first witness called on the following day. He sat on the stand, slumped forward. He looked at the prosecutor obediently. His eyes moved once in a while. He looked at the crowd, at the jury, at Rourke. It made no difference. Mr. Keating, will you state under oath whether you designed the project described to you, known as Cortlandt Homes? No, I didn't. Who designed it? Howard Rourke. At whose request? At my request. Why did you call on him? Because I was not capable of doing it myself. There was no sound of honesty in the voice, because there was no sound of effort to pronounce a truth of such nature. No tone of truth or falsehood. Only indifference.
In fact, she was right in that debate. I think I probably adamantly, completely denied it, but it is partially true what she said, that it was Russian agents, if not necessarily Russian nationals, but some of them, who led the campaign to take over some of the buildings and led the protest movement to take over some of the buildings in the Donbass at the start of the movement for autonomy there. Not really separatism, but just demanding strong federalism, like statehood level federalism for their province. So fine, even if you want to say whatever, that Putin and his secret services and intelligence agencies bear 100% of the responsibility for that, which is not the case. But even if that's the argument, it's still Obama's fault, as he said himself in the case of Crimea, but same argument, that this was a reaction to the transition of the government in Kiev that he said we helped to accomplish there. And so it doesn't absolve Putin. Nothing that I said in that debate or that I write in the book is about absolving the Russians. It's just explaining about the role that the Americans had in all this. Bob Higgs, I believe in the case of Pearl Harbor, coined the phrase truncating the antecedents. They always want to say, yeah, and then them Japs attacked our naval base. Can you believe that? But it was like, wait, what happened before and then? You know, what are we talking about here? What did FDR do? And we know now from the McCollum memo, it was a deliberate 8-point plan to provoke them into attacking us. Oh, that's kind of relevant information, huh? It's the same kind of thing here. We're literally, in the words of, I guess I could find it for you, where Obama says that this is not a plan. And in fact, this is in an interview with Jeffrey Goldberg, if people want to look it up, where he's kind of defending Jeffrey Goldberg saying, oh, if you were tougher, then this wouldn't have happened. What about that? And this kind of thing. And he's saying, oh yeah, well, I don't know. Bush had 100,000 troops in Iraq when Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, which again was a response to a provocation by the guy that they had installed in the coup of 2003, by the way, you know. Let me see if I can find the Obama quote for you. I'm paging through the correct section here, I believe. Okay, so here it is, Tom. It's Obama to Fareed Zakaria on CNN. And he says, Mr. Putin made this decision around Crimea and Ukraine, not because of some grand strategy, but essentially because he was caught off balance by the protests in the Maidan and Yanukovych then fleeing after we had brokered a deal to transition power in Ukraine. So that was CNN, and that's February 1st, 2015. And so that's the truth of it. And I got a lot more experts, including Hawks, in the book explaining that we provoked the guy. This is not about reconquering Eastern Europe. It never was. And look, there's no reason to believe that Vladimir Putin is really an ideologue at all. After 20 years in power, I mean, I'm not saying he ain't ruthless. Of course he's ruthless. He's a strong man, as they say, essentially president for life like Roosevelt, something like that. But I don't think that means that he had Roosevelt's ambition.
The prosecutor handed him a sheet of paper. Is this the agreement you signed? Keating held the paper in his hand. Yes. Is that Howard Rourke's signature? Yes. Will you please read the terms of this agreement to the jury? Keating read it aloud. His voice came evenly, well drilled. Nobody in the courtroom realized that this testimony had been intended as a sensation. It was not a famous architect publicly confessing incompetence. It was a man reciting a memorized lesson. People felt that, were he interrupted, He would not be able to pick up the next sentence, but would have to start all over again from the beginning. He answered a great many questions. The prosecutor introduced in evidence Rourke's original drawings of Cortlandt, which Keating had kept, the copies which Keating had made of them, and photographs of Cortlandt as it had been built.
Sure. It was evident to me when I first went out to that Israel and Palestine 17 years ago that there was systematic discrimination, especially in the occupied territories, between Jews and non-Jews. And if you were not Jewish, you had no rights. They would take your house away. They would take your land away. They would take your life away. You had no political rights. And that, in 2006, the same year that I went out there, so that is apartheid. That sort of legal structure, and it is legal, especially if you look at the 2018 nation-state law, basically their constitution saying Jews have the exclusive right to self-determination in the land, i.e. if you're Palestinian, you really have no rights. This was evident to Jimmy Carter back in 2006. He said, apartheid is the future here. Get your heads around this. And he got thrown out of the Democratic Party for saying so. What has happened since then, and especially the last 2 years, 3 years, is that because Israel has turned its back on the two-state solution that was going to give Palestinians a state 30 years ago, came with great promise, because Israel has abandoned any pretense of trying to give Palestinians a state, human rights groups have finally said, look, we got to call this what it is. It's apartheid. And those reports that used to be taboo in Washington have been tabooed by the Congress, started coming out in 2019, 2020, 2021, and many of the leading human rights groups in the world, including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, have said, look, this is apartheid. It's a regime of Jewish supremacy. And now what is significant about that post that you mentioned is that you have a group of Washington insiders connected with the Brookings Foundation and George Washington University saying it's apartheid. And everyone in Washington knows it. You're not allowed to say it, but everyone knows that now. They've turned there is no two-state solution. We have to accept that there's one state, and in that one state, the two-state solution was going to give Palestinians a state, and this whole thing was temporary where they had no rights in the occupied territories. It's not temporary. So that is the important slippage that is now taking place. I hope that answers your question.
Sure. And you point at this article in Foreign Affairs, Israel's one-state reality.
Why did you object so strenuously to the excellent structural changes suggested by Mr. Prescott and Mr. Webb? I was afraid of Howard Rourke. What did your knowledge of his character lead you to expect? Anything. What do you mean? I don't know. I was afraid. I used to be afraid. The questions went on. The story was unusual, but the audience felt bored. It did not sound like the recital of a participant. The other witnesses had seemed to have a more personal connection with the case. When Keating left the stand, the audience had the odd impression that no change had occurred in the act of a man's exit, as if no person had walked out. The prosecution rests, said the district attorney. The judge looked at Rourke. Proceed, he said. His voice was gentle. Rourke got up. Your Honor, I shall call no witnesses. This will be my testimony and my summation. Take the oath. Rourke took the oath.
Economic and market front. Oh, yeah. Recession could throw $1 trillion of debt into distress. Oh, yeah, I wonder what that is all about. Yep. Layoffs. Producer prices increases are going up. The worst is yet to come. What's going on in the housing market? Office building bust. Where people are putting their money. Oh, today the markets were down some 330-something points. Gold took a hit. Oh, you know why gold took a hit? They say because of the debt ceiling crisis, the debt ceiling. They're gonna make a deal. They always make a deal. They'll make a deal. So here's the deal. Are they going to lower interest rates? Are they going to keep them the same in the United States? Or are they going to raise them? And what does those three things mean? Nobody knows what they're going to do. Remember, the people running the game are nothing more than bullshit. That's all they are.
Bullshit. 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 Bullshit.
Oh, that was bullshit, that there's no inflation, it's temporary, it's transitory, transgendatory. So we don't know what they're going to do, but we're giving you the analysis of if they do this, if they do that, if they do this, where it's going to go, where the markets are going to go, where housing is going to go, where manufacturing is going to go, and on the geopolitical front, when the economy fails, jobs go with it. This is our 39th week of doing this. Spotlight on inflation. Spotlight on China. Oh, in Zimbabwe, they're issuing gold coins. I mean, who gives a fuck about Zimbabwe? It's not about that. It's about a bigger issue.
He stood by the steps of the witness stand. The audience looked at him. They felt he had no chance. They could drop the nameless resentment, the sense of insecurity which he aroused in most people. And so for the first time, they could see him as he was, a man totally innocent of fear. The fear of which they thought was not the normal kind, not a response to a tangible danger, but the chronic, unconfessed fear in which they all lived. They remembered the misery of the moments when, in loneliness, a man thinks of the bright words he could have said, but had not found, and hates those who robbed him of his courage. The misery of knowing how strong and able one is in one's own mind, the radiant picture never to be made real. Dreams? Self-delusion? Or a murdered reality, unborn, killed by that corroding emotion without name? Fear, need, dependence, hatred?
Empire, and they needed the authority. So, the very difficult vote I had to cast was to use military force to deal with the thugs that came and bombed it.
Yeah.
But that was taken and totally distorted as a license to perpetuate war
everywhere. Yeah.
Without any declaration of war whatsoever. And then also that first day or two, what they had the Patriot Act, which was an attack on civil liberties, which they were able to use many of the authorities that was granted there for enforcing on COVID rules and regulation. Yeah. So these are opportunities. And one thing that sort of got me on all this was when George Bush, not in a confrontational manner, and that was probably his greatest asset for what he wanted done. He said, well, we understand exactly what's going on. They came here and bombed us, and we have to deal with it, and we have to attack. But we have to understand why they do it. People want to know, why did they do it? He says they did it because they hated our freedoms and our prosperity. And I consider that a gross distortion of the facts and a gross distortion that has led and participated and maybe even caused most of this tragedy by not asking the one question. That every time there's a murder, domestic murder or killing, what's the motivation? What's the motivation? Who could be motivated to shoot this guy? And and they look into it. But the American people and the journalists have never asked what was the real motivation. This idea that all this was because of Hollywood and because of our living standards and because we were prosperous. It was all rigged in order to put into place plans that had already been laid.
Yeah. Well, they hate us for our freedom and prosperity. Ironically, we took care of that because we don't have any freedom left and our prosperity's gone, so they won. Now, you mentioned the authorization for the use of force in 2001, and here's something interesting from that cradle write-up of the Watson report, which is that according to the Congressional Research Service, the 2001 authorization for the use of military force has been used to justify more than 40 military interventions in at least 22 countries without congressional approval. I didn't realize that. I didn't know 40 military interventions in 22 countries without Congress, all from that little resolution about 9/11, going after the people who attacked us on 9/11.
Yeah, so you give them an inch of authority to respond to an emergency, and they turn it into license to kill, license to operate war at will. And actually, this article pointed out something that I was not aware of. They talked about a secret cooperation authority, SCA, and it's part of what they're doing is they're involved in many of those cases. They never make it to Congress. Nobody ever hears about it, and but they're pursued, and that was part of those 44 countries that we've been involved in, and that is done in secrecy. So the big issues are always secret, and there's no audit. If you want to know how they're doing at the Fed and spending their trillions of dollars and taking care of everybody's friends and fighting these wars, then you ought to audit the Fed. And if you're worrying about what's going on with the war and how the weapons disappear and then they're resold and all this, doesn't the Pentagon ever audit? No, they've never been audited in the true sense of the word. And as long as the money machine goes and the authoritarians want to have a global economy and you have the Soroses, cooperating with some people that are supposed to be the good guys, that's going to continue. But the dead end, unfortunately, isn't going to be when the light bulb goes on for the American people to really wake up. It's going to be when this whole thing comes down in bankruptcy, because this cannot continue. But whether it's going to last 6 months or 6 years, nobody really knows, because they've been able to patch it together. But you can't have any society operate like this other than without the loss of more liberty. But you've already described, that's exactly what happened. We lost our freedoms, and we certainly haven't been living in peace by our great victories.
Rourke stood before them as each man stands in the innocence of his own mind. But Rourke stood like that before a hostile crowd. And they knew suddenly that no hatred was possible to him. For the flash of an instant, they grasped the manner of his consciousness. Each asked himself, do I need anyone's approval? Does it matter? Am I tied? And for that instant, each man was free. Free enough to feel benevolence for every other man in the room. It was only a moment. The moment of silence when Rourke was about to speak. Thousands of years ago, the first man discovered how to make fire. He was probably burned at the stake he had taught his brothers to light. He was considered an evildoer who had dealt with a demon mankind dreaded. But thereafter men had fire to keep them warm, to cook their food, to light their caves. He had left them a gift they had not conceived, and he had lifted darkness off the earth.
I suppose we have to add to all of this the elephant in the room, which is inflation, which is, of course, only caused by government. Free money, higher interest rates, massive debt. People in the street have to be suffering in Europe as much as we are here with the cost of food and gasoline.
35% of Italians are really struggling to make ends meet, 35%, because the inflation is so high. I mean, prices of gasoline are very high. Food is about 20%. In much of Europe, it's very high, and people are finding the lines for food banks in London are growing enormously. So yeah, it's there and it's coming, but people just pretend it's not there. The press just doesn't report it. In America, you do. In Europe, we don't.
Do you think the West is tired of the war in Ukraine?
Yes, yes, increase. Very much so. I'm talking now about ordinary Europeans. I don't think that's true of the elites. I think they are finding themselves, they've dug themselves in a hole. And they thought that they were going to be, if you recall, only a couple of months ago, people were saying, well, with this offensive, the war is going to be over. It'll be, we'll see the offensive come and Russia will collapse and the war will be over. And so all you've got to do. And so I think even states that were quite skeptical about this sort of assessment went along with it, because they thought, okay, we give up all our armories, we give up what we've got in the armories, but then that's the end of it. It's finished, because the offensive will take place this summer, war will be over, and now the narrative is switched completely, and the narrative is saying, no, that's not good enough, because this offensive is not going to be definitive. Now we have to go in for a long range of building supply lines, building munitions, industrial capacity. We have to go turn our economies into war economies in order to fight Russia in the long run.
Centuries later, the first man invented the wheel. He was probably torn on the rack he had taught his brothers to build. He was considered a transgressor who ventured into forbidden territory. But thereafter, men could travel past any horizon. He had left them a gift they had not conceived, and he had opened the roads of the world. That man, the unsubmissive and first, stands in the opening chapter of every legend mankind has recorded about its beginning. Prometheus was chained to a rock and torn by vultures because he had stolen the fire of the gods. Adam was condemned to suffer because he had eaten the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Whatever the legend, somewhere in the shadows of its memory, mankind knew that its glory began with one, and that one paid for his courage.
Now you have the British and these other European countries. Also Belgium said that they want to train Ukrainian pilots. There's going to be a lot of pressure on the U.S. just to say, see, you don't even have to send your own F-16s, just sign off on these deliveries. And NATO countries have yet to provide Western-made aircraft to Kiev, and it would mark another big escalation of NATO's, involvement in the war, giving Ukraine an air force. Poland and Slovakia recently shipped their Soviet-made MiG-29 fighter jets to Ukraine. That was an escalation in itself, as those were the first fighter jets that NATO provided. If you remember, in the early days of the war, NATO chose not to send MiGs because they thought Russia could perceive that as the alliance directly entering the war, and things are just so much different, over a year later. And the British have really been leading the charge on the escalation of support for Ukraine, and all this stuff risks provoking a response from Russia. They recently began delivering those Storm Shadow cruise missiles, the depleted uranium shells for the tanks that they sent Ukraine. And in response to that, Putin said he's deploying nukes to Belarus. So it's a pretty big response there. And the UK was also the first to pledge that they would send Western-made heavy tanks, and they sent their Challenger 2 tank to Ukraine. So I think we're probably going to see this pretty soon, the US either signing off on the delivery or announcing that they're going to send F-16s. All right, the next one here. Russia says that it is open to Ukraine peace proposals from Africa and Brazil. So Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Wednesday that Moscow is ready to look at peace proposals for the conflict in Ukraine from African leaders and from Brazil. Lavrov said, quote, "In both cases, we responded to initiatives from Latin America and African friends that we were ready to consider any of their proposals that were prompted by a sincere desire to help stabilize the world order," end quote. Next one here. The U.S. wants joint military planning with Israel on Iran. So the U.S. has proposed to Israel to conduct joint military planning on potential attacks on Iran, Axios reported on Wednesday. The report cited U.S. and Israeli officials who said the idea was proposed a few weeks ago during recent visits to Israel by Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. So Israel is known for conducting covert attacks inside Iran, and they've stepped up their threats to launch an overt military attack against the Islamic Republic. In recent years, they've really stepped up this rhetoric, but it's not clear if Israel could actually pull off, a big attack on Iran without U.S. support. And the U.S. and Israel have been stepping up military cooperation. They held their largest ever joint military exercises in January. U.S. officials told Axios that the proposal for joint planning against Iran is unprecedented and could significantly boost U.S.-Israel military ties even more.
Throughout the centuries, there were men who took first steps down new roads, armed with nothing but their own vision. Their goals differed, but they all had this in common, that the step was first, the road new, the vision unborrowed, and the response they received, hatred. The great creators, the thinkers, the artists, the scientists, the inventors, stood alone against the men of their time. Every great new thought was opposed. Every great new invention was denounced. The first motor was considered foolish, the airplane was considered impossible, the power loom was considered vicious, anesthesia was considered sinful. But the men of unborrowed vision went ahead. They fought, they suffered, and they paid. But they won.
But the report that came out this week from Brussels is that NATO's, laying plans that they haven't done for a while to major defense plans. So I wonder what they know that we don't know. I mean, we know the danger of coming, but could this mean that it's getting closer, that they're preparing? But how effective are they going to be? Is this a whole lot of noise? Because maybe NATO is not quite as strong as they thought they were. Politically, they're not as strong, as the EU isn't as strong, as United States foreign policy isn't as strong as it used to be, and also the financing of that foreign policy is getting more difficult all the time, because right now our Congress is facing, how can we lie enough to the people so they'll accept the fact that we got to keep the government open and do whatever we can, print more money, and go around the laws, whatever they need to do it. So there's a lot of ifs there, but there's still a very strong effort. So I would say that maybe this announcement of these plans for greater defense by NATO should be observed and should be maybe a warning. But I don't quite think that if they're thinking clearly that they're ready to march. And I don't think that that's going to happen. But the march on maintaining our empire and control, the importance of oil, and the importance of the military-industrial complex, all of that is going to continue. And that might be the war that is obviously the most important, an attack on our liberties here at home, an attack of our financial system.
What's important, we read earlier today, is that at this summit coming up in July, NATO, for the first time in decades, is going to approve, it's classified now, but a new plan for what they call a, quote, defensive war with Russia. Now, they have not had updated plans for war with Russia, since basically the end of the Cold War, because they didn't view a war with Russia as a threat. If we can just put that back up really quick. They didn't view a war with Russia as something that would be coming up. So the fact that they are planning on that, this is, of course, we can't rule out that this is a psyop and they're trying to signal that, hey, we're the tough guys, we're going to take this on. But nevertheless, the fact that they are planning a war with Russia says a lot.
It isn't that hard. We should not allow our government to do anything that we ourselves aren't allowed to do. If we can't steal from our neighbor, why can't we send our congressman there to steal from our neighbor to get something we want? Well, the same way internationally. There's such basic rules that most people would shake their head, yeah, that sounds good, but they're locked in because now the welfare state has been solidified ever since almost, he's going to go up to 100 years now. That we have transferred and the republic that we've had into now a country that really is run by the corporatists, which people should be fearful of, to distrust the government, because corporatism usually goes into under the authoritarian government and communism and fascism.
And a couple of good quotes, I think, Dr. Paul. And here's Dershowitz. He says, I think it reveals that Americans are right to distrust the government, even civil servants, people in the government. The case demonstrates that people are prepared to distort the Constitution to get their way, to get their partisan political way.
They never give up because I think their brain doesn't accept the fact that, well, I think the one thing is this whole thing about nihilism, because their level of morality is such that, yes, it doesn't fit the scenario that you people who talk about higher laws, but we're in a place which is we run the country, we run the world, we're the globalists, and they depend on us. So to them, they really believe they're speaking the truth. I accept that. Maybe I'm giving them too much leeway, but they do it. Otherwise, they would probably want to go out and commit suicide for being so stupid, because they've killed so many people with these senseless wars. So they have to rationalize it. And just thinking, yesterday we reported on the millions that have died.
No creator was prompted by a desire to serve his brothers, for his brothers rejected the gift he offered, and that gift destroyed the slothful routine of their lives. His truth was his only motive, his own truth, and his own work to achieve it in his own way. A symphony, a book, an engine, a philosophy, an airplane, or a building. That was his goal and his life, not those who heard, read, operated, believed, flew, or inhabited the thing he had created. The creation, not its users. The creation, not the benefits others derived from it. The creation which gave form to his truth. He held his truth above all things and against all men.
Listen to this, because this is very fucking wild.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon, and one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." I said, "We're going to war with Iraq? Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we got a good military and we can take down governments." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, "I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
It's like insane that this was just said. How do they not talk about that every day?
My hat is off to my friend, Judge Bum. She wrote a brilliant, gifted, thoroughly researched opinion. Yeah, if you took that opinion and brought it to a publisher and published it as a book, it is a treatise on the right to keep and bear arms in the United States of America today and the history of that right. Why is history in there? Because the Bruin opinion, the Justice Thomas decision 11 months ago, saying every state is a shall carry state, says the laws today shall be the same as they've been throughout the history of the United States. And if the states have treated your right to carry weapons historically, that's what they're going to go back to. Because the law today needs to be the same as it was when the Second Amendment was adopted. When it was adopted, 6 of the 13 states required their citizens to be armed when they were in public places. Oh, how the times have changed. Well, we're not requiring people to carry guns, but we're allowing those who know how to use them to do so. At the same time that Judge Bum did this, The Supreme Court of the United States. We've been waiting for Justice Barrett. Justice Barrett, we're waiting for you. Study constitutional law under the same geniuses that I did at Notre Dame Law School. We're a generation apart. We're waiting. You had this application to stop the enforcement of this law in Illinois that makes it illegal to use semi-automatic rifles, not a machine gun, one trigger pull where there's a fusillade of rounds that come out, but one trigger pull per round. And you didn't do it. The Supreme Court of the United States declined today to interfere with Illinois' law. Now, this is not a final decision. This is not a decision on the merits. This is a preliminary decision. This is a sort of gut reaction by the court on the basis of documents that were submitted. There still will be a trial before a federal judge in Chicago, and then there'll be an appeal to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals in Chicago, and then whichever side loses will appeal it to the Supreme Court of the United States. But isn't it insane that there are states in the Union, New Jersey tried to do this, and Illinois has done it, in which the very same weapons that the state police use to protect the governor are illegal for anybody else to possess. I don't get it. If the government exists by the consent of the governed, how could we consent to the government doing something that we don't have the power to do? How can we give the government the power to do something and then the government takes that power away from us? We should take it away from the government. At the same time that the Supreme Court, there's no vote, there's no dissent. It probably was 9-0, or maybe 2 or 3 of them dissented. They didn't want to publish their dissent because it's just preliminary. They usually don't write dissents on these preliminary rulings. At the same time that the Supreme Court did this, President Biden wrote another one of his op-eds. They all end the same. Let's do this for God's sake. For God's sake. He wants to make it more difficult for law-abiding people to own guns. That's what he wants to do. Mr. President, I know you want more thorough background checks. I know you want to outlaw certain types of weapons like the ones that were just outlawed in Illinois and now are the subject of a trial in Chicago. But do you really think the bad guys would obey those laws? Come on. All you'll be doing is taking rights away from honest, decent, hardworking, law-abiding people who are trained to use these weapons. And do you really want to take away from us the same weapons that the Secret Service uses to protect you? Is that where we're going in this country? More Soviet Union than United States when the government gets this way. Read the Heller opinion. Justice Scalia, 2008. Not only is the right to own a weapon a natural right, it comes from our humanity, doesn't come from the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment keeps the government theoretically from interfering with it. It doesn't craft or create the right. But what kind of weapon can you own, Justice Scalia? God rest his soul in heaven. He answered in that opinion. Same weapons that the bad guys use and the same weapons that the government has. Because the right to keep and bear arms is the right to defend yourself from bad guys and from the government if it is taken over by tyrants. I'll repeat this. The right to keep and bear arms is the right to protect yourself against bad guys when the police aren't able to get there. They never get there before while the killing is going on. They always get there too late. It's not their fault. People call them after the crime starts. And your right to protect yourself against and shoot at agents of the government when it is taken over by tyrants. So why can the government have weapons that the rest of us can't? Old Joe can't answer that question. All he knows is he'll win votes on the left in 2024 if he keeps pounding the table for more sophisticated, more thorough background checks. Background checks don't save lives. All they do is extend the time that an honest, decent, hardworking person who submits to the background check has to wait before they can buy a gun. Bad people don't go through background checks. Killers don't go through background checks. Killers aren't worried about gun control laws. Killers only stop when good guys, whether they're wearing badges and uniforms or civilian clothes, show up with a gun and kill them.
His vision, his strength, his courage came from his own spirit. A man's spirit, however, is his self, that entity which is his consciousness. To think, to feel, to judge, to act are functions of the ego. The creators were not selfless. It is the whole secret of their power, that it was self-sufficient, self-motivated, self-generated, a first cause, a fount of energy, a life force, a prime mover. The Creator served nothing and no one. He lived for himself. And only by living for himself was he able to achieve the things which are the glory of mankind. Such is the nature of achievement.
Of course, this also, let's just say, the puzzles fit pretty neatly together for the another angle that we've had on top of all of this. So basically what we have been saying from the very beginning of this Trump-Russia collusion insanity, which if you can remember, I know it feels like a few years ago was a few centuries ago these days because so much crazy shit's happened in the last few years. But if you can remember back to this time, basically our central belief on the whole thing was that the entire narrative that Russia overthrew our elections, that Trump was compromised by the Russians, that the Russians had installed him, and that there was some type of conspiracy going on here, that the entire thing was not only untrue, but that it was an intentional, deep state ploy to frame the sitting president at the time for treason in an attempted coup, to essentially try to overthrow the democratically elected leader by framing him for treason. But on top of that, we also, I think, made a pretty devastating case that, contrary to the popular narrative on MSNBC, Bob Barr was not some Trump puppet. In fact, he was a career-long deep stater who was much more of a Bushite than a Trumpite. And in fact, he was kind of there to play the role of controlled opposition, to say, so they could come away and say, even Donald Trump's puppet admits that no charges can be brought against anyone. And so this Durham report, in my view, fits very nicely with that. It's years later, when all interest has kind of been lost in the subject, at least by the masses. I'm going to come out and let you know, yes, I can confirm that the government did the most horrific, shady things possible. Clearly, the only summary you could take from this is that there was a coordinated effort to try to frame the president of the United States for treason. And my conclusion is that no charges will be brought. More or less, that to me is if I could sum up in a sentence or two, the Durham report, it's that. Here is undeniable proof that all of these people conspired to frame the president of the United States. And my recommendation is we shouldn't do that again. That's more or less this report. Wasn't, but we now know that Obama was briefed on this. And so just to keep this in mind, that Obama, through all the time when he was pushing the theories as well, he was well aware that this had started in Hillary Clinton's campaign as a specific tactic to as it says in the report, to distract away from her email scandal. To say, oh, yeah, well, he's in bed with Vladimir Putin. And this way they could also lump Julian Assange in with the Russians. And then anytime they wanted to talk about Hillary Clinton's emails, this could be her out. Well, this is just because my opponent's a Russian puppet, as she called him at one of the debates. If you remember, there was an interesting moment in the 2016 debates when Hillary Clinton called Donald Trump a Russian puppet. This is, again, Rob, if you're talking about changes in the way media covers the debates, changes in politics, that is, look, for someone who's 40, who kind of remembers the time before this latest batch of insanity, as crazy as politics is, and it's always, it's always corruption, but that was something you just wouldn't hear between the Republican and Democratic nominee on the presidential debate stage, to look over to the other person and say, you're a Russian puppet. That's kind of a new line. And Donald Trump's response, interestingly enough at the time, was, he goes, I'm no puppet, you're the puppet. Which just seems kind of like a Donald Trump third grade response, although now it seems like there might have been a little bit more to it. Look, we've made the point before, but it's worth restating here that Mueller could have come out at any time and put an end to this insane media blitz.
Well, he was a part of it. He's one of the higher
clearly.
ups. Yeah,
clearly. And he was, and right, because it seems like in many ways that was kind of one of the points of the whole thing, right? Was to be well, look, even if we can't remove him, then we'll be able at least to make this the story of his entire presidency and box him into a corner where he can't work with Russia, which is, by the way, again, if you remember back then, this was Donald Trump was running on, shouldn't we have détente with Russia and get along with Russia and work with them to end all of the wars in the Middle East? They're in Syria at the time, killing ISIS. Great. We'll let them kill ISIS. We'll pull our troops out. We'll get out of the business of trying to overthrow these regimes in the Middle East, and we'll make friends with Russia. We'll have a good relationship with them. And then this was to box him into a corner where he couldn't follow through on that, because when you're getting called a Russian spy every day on TV, it's pretty hard to then come out and say, I'm cutting a deal with Russia, because that would have just been, look, proof that he is in fact a Russian spy. And so he didn't. And in fact, he started trying to prove what a Russian spy he wasn't by being more adversarial toward Russia. And didn't that work out wonderfully? Where we are now. What a great strategy that was for the safety of the world, not to mention the people of Ukraine who have suffered the brunt of it.
And think about how much better off we would have been if this information came out sooner, because there could have been so many people that just knew that they shouldn't have opinions. And then they would have been spared getting the vaccines. Imagine if people could have found out 2 years ago, oh, I was lied into thinking that my president is actually a Russian asset. I remember being at dinner parties and people being just convinced of it. Fucking liberal snobbery, just giving you hell, saying Donald Trump, he clearly is a traitor and he works for the Russians. People believe this shit.
People still believe it.
And if
there's people out there who still say it.
But if the truth came out years ago, people would realize, oh, I'm really dumb and I shouldn't be listening to the television and I shouldn't be having opinions. And then they wouldn't be walking around with mRNAs in them right now.
What a great Hillary Clinton response to this. This jumped out at me as so funny. She said it was really sad. I get it. You have to go down every rabbit hole. It's just so funny that's just Hillary Clinton. She goes, it's a sad day for our country when you figure out that it was all me lying to everybody. But I understand you got to go down every rabbit hole. I get it.
If there's one clean takeaway, it's that the intelligence community is clearly operating for essentially the deep state, that your connected actors such as the Clinton could say, hey, here's what I'm looking for, and they'll go and do it, which we also saw quite clearly with the CIA with the Biden laptop.
Yeah.
I mean, if this isn't just clear as day to people that the FBI and the intelligence is not 40 intelligence people have said, and this, like, all that we've heard now for 8 years as being the basis for why every decision is made by government officials. Well, this is the information I got from the intelligence community. I mean, everyone should just hear that now and laugh and realize, okay, that means nothing. You might as well tell me you walked in the park and there was a talking frog that gave you this information.
Not every injustice or transgression amounts to a criminal offense. And he said, the law does not always make a person's bad judgment, even horribly bad judgment, standing alone a crime.
He also made a statement somewhere in it that it's not so much that the FBI's protocols need to be changed. It's like kind of what you said about laws or spells. It's like you can have all perfect protocols. If people are ignoring the protocols, it doesn't matter. Like if you got a guy who's lying on the Pfizer war and it doesn't matter what the procedure is it doesn't matter. The guy's lying on the thing. It's only as good as the people who are sitting there.
The point is that laws aren't spells, but people treat them like they are. As you know, I remember joking around with Michael Malice about this. We were talking about like the idea of like, you know, when like someone's pulled over by a cop and they're like screaming at the cop, I know my rights, you know, and like you've seen a million videos like this where someone's like yelling at the cop, I know my rights. And then I just watch them get dragged out of their car by the cop. And it really is, when you think about it, it's like the psychosis involved in this is like you have like a piece of paper, then outside your car is a man with a gun. And you're like, I know what's written down on this paper. And it's like, there's like, it's like imaginary world and real life. Real life is dude with a taser who's pointing a taser at you, about to tase you. And then you almost have like you have a copy of the Bill of Rights. And it's almost like you're sitting there going like, hocus pocus. Like, you know, you're not allowed to tase me. And then he's like, okay. And just lights you up. Like it doesn't matter necessarily what the rules are. In a sense, Durham's right about that. He's kind of like, well, we already have rules about this. We just need to follow the rules. Anyway, this is look, it's just one more piece of evidence. There's a lot of them at this point. There are too many to go through in one show, but it's one more piece in this puzzle, which just kind of, it makes it pretty clear what happened here. I really do think for anybody who's being honest and paying attention, it's way beyond the point that you could deny it. That it's just like, oh yeah, Donald Trump was fucking set up for this. And people get so goddamn bizarre when, particularly with Donald Trump, it brings out an unbelievable amount of just ridiculous tribalism and kind of this deranged religiosity about where you feel. You know, I've been getting this for years now, but you know, I'll say things like, you know, I'll be like, okay, Donald Trump was clearly framed for treason by his own deep state. And people will be like, oh, so Dave loves Donald Trump. Oh, really? Well, don't you know he did this thing wrong and this thing wrong? And you're like, well, yes, okay. That can be true. And it can also be true that he was framed by his own deep state for treason.
Man cannot survive except through his mind. He comes on earth unarmed. His brain is his only weapon. Animals obtain food by force. Man has no claws, no fangs, no horns, no great strength of muscle. He must plant his food or hunt it. To plant, he needs a process of thought. To hunt, he needs weapons, and to make weapons, a process of thought. From this simplest necessity to the highest religious abstraction, from the wheel to the skyscraper, everything we are and everything we have comes from a single attribute of man, the function of his reasoning mind. But the mind is an attribute of the individual. There is no such thing as a collective brain. There is no such thing as a collective thought. An agreement reached by a group of men is only a compromise or an average drawn upon many individual thoughts. It is a secondary consequence. The primary act, the process of reason, must be performed by each man alone. We can divide a meal among many men. We cannot digest it in a collective stomach. No man can use his lungs to breathe for another man. No man can use his brain to think for another. All the functions of body and spirit are private. They cannot be shared or transferred.
Patriot Act. It didn't pass unanimously. There was some opposition to the Patriot Act. Are all these people criminals because they didn't want to surrender all that individual liberty to the U.S. government? You know, the whole idea behind the Patriot Act was that we needed to give up our liberties to be safe, right? We had these terrorists that were going to hurt us. And so to protect us from terrorists, we had to surrender these essential constitutional liberties. I don't want to make that bargain. That's not a winning trade. I listened to the words of the founding fathers who said, I think it was either Jefferson or maybe it was Franklin. I get some of these quotes mixed up. But they said, you never want to give up liberty to get some safety. Because if you value your safety more than your liberty, and then you give up your liberty to get the safety, not only will you lose your liberty, you're going to lose your safety too. You don't want to do that. Look, because I want the government to abide by the law doesn't mean I'm in favor of criminality. You know, they're using a podcast against me where I said, look, I'd rather some people get away with tax evasion than all of us have to lose our constitutional rights. They're saying that means I'm in favor of tax evasion. That means I'm advocating tax evasion. I mean, could they actually be that dumb? No, I'm advocating for the Constitution. And I'm saying, yes, I want the government to get the bad guys, but they also have to protect the good guys. They have to protect our constitutional rights. At the same time, they have to figure out how to prosecute criminals, yet still protect the innocent. And our whole legal system is built on protecting the innocent. It's more important to protect the innocent than punish the guilty. You know, there's an expression that it's better that 100 guilty people go free than one innocent person be in prison. But apparently, that's not true in Australia. According to 60 Minutes Australia, down under, they would rather put 100 innocent people in jail just to make sure that one guilty guy doesn't get away with it. I mean, I don't know if it's really like that in Australia. I doubt it, but I wouldn't want to live in a country like that. You know, a lot of times in America, guilty people go free. It happens all the time. The cops screw up, right? Something happens with the chain of evidence. They break the chain or the custody, or they don't give somebody their Miranda rights. You know, they don't say you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and be used against you. If you don't Mirandize the suspect and then he says something, well, you know, it's inadmissible. So a lot of times guilty people are let go. It happens all the time to protect our constitutional rights. So the most important law that the government has to enforce really is the Constitution. Yes, I want the governments to go after the money launderers or people who break the law, but the most important law that has to be enforced is the Constitution. It's important that the government not break the law. It's more important that the government honor the law than any one individual, because when the government violates the law, the whole country suffers. You know, a criminal, yes, you know, some individuals suffer from a crime and that's bad, but not 300 million of us. So it's the government. That's where it's the most important. So if a crook, right, if a tax cheat gets away with tax cheating, that's okay if it means that we protect our constitutional rights. I am not willing to surrender my freedoms and liberties just so the government can catch every tax cheat. Some people are going to get away with it. You know, the government has to figure out how to enforce the tax laws while respecting the Constitution. Now, they're probably going to end up using this podcast against me. Oh, you see, this is proof. He's advocating for criminal behavior. No, I'm not. I want the government not to behave criminally. I want the government to obey the law. I guess in Australia, no one gives a damn what the government does. The government can do whatever it wants because maybe the Australian government is not restrained by a constitution the way the United States government is. Money on their credit cards in December. And so what generally happens in January, February is they pay down those balances. So it's a quarter where you typically see credit card debt going down. But in the first quarter of this year, credit card debt didn't go down at all. So Americans are using their credit cards as a lifeline. That's how they're dealing with higher prices. They're charging stuff. And in fact, if you just look at the month of March, in March, debt was up, credit card debt, just credit cards, not, all the other debt that's going up, $17.6 billion in March alone. That's in 1 month. And that represents a 17.3% year-over-year increase in the amount of credit card debt that households are carrying. The interest rates on that credit card debt is 20% on all that money. Now, this also shows you that the Fed is making no progress on inflation because the consumer keeps spending. Where are they getting the money? They're borrowing it. Credit continues to expand. That's part of the inflationary dynamic. Inflation is about an expansion of the money supply, which includes credit, because this credit is being spent. So consumers are not cutting back on their spending because of higher prices. They're not even cutting back on their spending because of higher interest rates. They just keep on spending. So prices are going to keep on rising. And this next quarter-point rate hike isn't going to be any more effective than the previous rate hikes, which means they're going to have to do it again. They're going to have to go from 5.25 to 5.5 to 5.5, 5.75, 6, 7, 8. They're going to have to keep hiking rates. But no matter how much they hike it, it's not going to matter. That's what the markets still don't understand. Gold, again, sold off on this tougher Fed. Oh, the Fed's going to fight harder to beat inflation. No, the Fed is losing its fight with inflation. That's why it's going to try harder, but it's going to be ineffective. If they couldn't beat inflation with 5, they're not going to beat it with 5.25. And again, all of these rate hikes are price hikes. They're all going to be built in to the cost structure, the price structure of all of these businesses that are having to deal with rising prices. And we got the leading economic indicators that came out today. I've been talking a lot about the LEI. It was down again, not as much as the prior month, but it was down for the 13th consecutive month. Now, the last time we had a losing streak that bad was 2007 to 2008. June, I wrote it down, June 2007 through April 2008. That was like the financial crisis, the collapse of Lehman Brothers. That's where you have to go to find a streak longer. And it was actually 22 months of negative LEI. Now, we're only at 13 months now, but, I think we're going to break that record. And the most ironic part about it is the biggest positive indicator in the LEI, and without this, it would have been lower, is the stock market, because the stock market is going up. But I've said this before, the stock market going up is not a sign of a strong economy. It's actually the reverse. The reason the stock market is going up is because investors expect a recession, and they expect the Fed to cut rates at some point due to that recession. And that's why the stock market is going up, although, there's also the AI stuff. But, the flip side in the short run of companies using AI to lower their costs, the reason that AI lowers your costs is because you lay off your workers. That's how you save money. You have AI do the work instead of employees. So in the short run, that's going to fuel the unemployment. And again, maybe the market's like that because they think, oh, the Fed's going to see this unemployment and they're going to have to reverse course. But again, the reason that that's not going to be good, I don't think, for the markets is because inflation is still going to be a problem, and that problem is going to get even more out of hand as the Fed starts easing to try to prop up the collapsing economy, right? So that's why they want to raise the debt ceiling, not because it's going to ensure our prosperity. It's just going to ensure our demise happens later. But that collapse, when it happens later, will be worse. You see, the more they succeed in postponing the inevitable, the worse the inevitable gets. And we know it's inevitable because what are they saying? If we don't raise the debt ceiling, we can't pay our bills. Well, that means we're broke. If we can't pay our bills unless we go deeper into debt, then we are broke right now, right? Because in theory, we have plenty of revenue to pay our bills, right? Because interest on the national debt isn't even 10% of the current federal spending. So the government can do it. They just have to cut spending someplace or raise taxes, but they refuse to do that. And so they want to raise the debt ceiling. But I also want to talk again about this idea that they can invoke the 14th Amendment, because more and more people now are talking about this. In fact, Biden is actually saying that this is what he might do. And he claims that the debt ceiling is unconstitutional because it violates the 14th Amendment. And it doesn't do that at all. In fact, the only time that the government seems to care about the Constitution is when it inhibits their spending, right? I mean, that's what the Constitution is supposed to do. Limit government spending, limit government power. That's what it was written for. But the 14th Amendment has got nothing to do with the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling isn't unconstitutional. What would be unconstitutional is trying to use the 14th Amendment to circumvent the debt ceiling. All the 14th Amendment reads, in part, is that the debts of the United States shall not be questioned. Questioned. That's all it says. Nobody is questioning the debt. We have tremendous debt. We all know that. Nobody is in denial that we have debt, right? So the debt is not in question. The question is, can we pay the debt? And the answer is no. Nothing in the Constitution says that the debt has to be paid. It just says that it can't be questioned. Now, of course, if Biden feels an obligation to pay the debt, then pay it. But you just can't go above the debt ceiling. We have a limit. We have a legal limit on the amount of debt the government is able to take on. That's not unconstitutional. And if the government wants to pay the interest on its debt, there is nothing stopping them from doing that. The debt ceiling isn't stopping them from doing that. The government has plenty of money to pay the debts. If they don't pay the debts, it's because they chose not to. They chose to prioritize some other expenditure over paying interest on the national debt. So it's got nothing to do with the 14th Amendment. It's got nothing to do with the debt ceiling. It's got to do with Congress's refusal and the president's refusal to cut any government spending. Target's earnings came out, and Target admitted that they lost about $500 million on the quarter to $1 billion. They're not sure exactly how much, but due to theft, right? They talked about inventory shrinkage, and so they lost all this inventory. At least 500 million of it was theft, but maybe as much as $1 billion, but somewhere in there was due to theft. Now, it's obvious, right, what's happening, right? We have all of this lawlessness, following, the Black Lives Matters, George Floyd, all those protests where all the police just, backed away from enforcing the law and basically let it be known that shoplifting wouldn't be prosecuted. And the police basically stood down, giving the criminals carte blanche to commit crimes, knowing that they're going to get away with it. And so it's not a surprise that we have a crime wave. In fact, I predicted this crime wave years ago, that this was going to be the obvious consequence of, defunding the police, or the police basically afraid to go after criminals, right? So we sent out invitations to criminals to commit crimes. Why are we surprised that these criminals have accepted those invitations and are now committing crimes? But Target doesn't want to admit that. They don't want to be called racist, I guess, or they want to be politically correct. So in their earnings report, they don't mention anything about this. There's only one reason that they came up with that I heard of. I mean, if there's another one, it didn't make it into the news reports that I listened to. But they're blaming it on the proliferation of online marketplaces that make it a lot easier for criminals to sell the stuff that they steal. Sites like eBay, right, where you can sell stuff. So apparently that's why there's all this crime, because of these online marketplaces. That is pure BS, because these online marketplaces have been around for a long time. That was one of the first businesses that came up on the internet. eBay's been around for a long time, and they're not the only site where people can sell stuff. No, that's not why. And in fact, if that was the reason, then you would expect to see crime kind of evenly distributed throughout all of their stores. They know that all of that criminal activity, all of that theft is happening in specific locations, right? They know where all the stores are that are getting robbed. The smart business decision would be to shut those stores down, but they don't want to do it. They are afraid because they know what's going to happen. If they go into one of these cities, right, that may be heavily minority, where all these crimes are being committed, and so their stores are losing money. They are losing money on these stores. But if they shut them down, they are going to be the subject of all kinds of protests. They're going to be accused of racism or whatever they're going to get accused of. I've already played clips, or I've watched clips where that has happened when stores have been closed. I mean, it was Walmart, whoever it was closing some of these stores because there was so much theft, and there was a huge protest. How dare you do this? These are our stores. How dare you close them? As if, the public owns the stores. They don't. These are businesses. They are there to make a profit. And if they can't make a profit because all of their inventory gets stolen, then they should close down. But they're not closing down. So they're saying they're trying to introduce different ways that they can cut back on theft. None of it's going to work. The theft is going to continue because there's nothing they can do about it in the current political environment in these communities. And so what's going to end up happening if a company like Target, and Target stock was down about 4% today, not actually that big a move. I think the stock should be down more than that, and maybe it will be over time, because I think that they're in trouble here. But they're going to have to keep these stores open, and the merchandise is going to keep getting stolen, and so they're going to keep losing money on these stores. Now, let's say they just raise prices in these stores to offset all the money they lose at those stores. Well, they're going to have outrage again. Well, you're price gouging the customers who can least afford it, right? This isn't fair. Why are you raising prices in these neighborhoods? Maybe the neighborhoods would be more African American. They'll say, "Oh, you're discriminating. You're charging African Americans more. But how come you're not raising prices over here where there's white customers?" Right? So they don't want to do that. They're going to end up having to raise prices on all their stores everywhere in order to cover the losses on these stores that they don't have the guts to close because they don't want to be politically incorrect. And so everybody is going to end up paying higher prices all over the country at every Target to cover all the theft that is taking place at stores that they should close, but they're not closing. And so then that's going to give their competitors an advantage, because if I'm not Target and I'm opening up a store near Target, maybe I can offer lower prices because I don't have to make up for the losses on stores where I'm losing a lot to theft because I don't have a store in those locations, right? I'm just going to open up a store in the locations where people aren't stealing, and so I'll be at a competitive advantage.
We inherit the products of the thought of other men. We inherit the wheel. We make a cart. The cart becomes an automobile. The automobile becomes an airplane. But all through the process, what we receive from others is only the end product of their thinking. The moving force is the creative faculty, which takes this product as material, uses it, and originates the next step. The creative faculty cannot be given or received, shared or borrowed. It belongs to single, individual men. That which it creates is the property of the creator. Men learn from one another, but all learning is only the exchange of material. No man can give another the capacity to think. Yet that capacity is our only means of survival. Nothing is given to man on earth. Everything he needs has to be produced. And here man faces his basic alternative. He can survive in only one of two ways: by the independent work of his own mind, or as a parasite fed by the minds of others.
Gold took a hit today. The reason gold took a hit today is now the bet on the street is that they're going to be raising interest rates. When they met earlier this month, the bet was they weren't going to raise them. They're going to keep them steady. And now the odds for a June rate hike are getting close to 50%. It was 10% a week ago. So now you're hearing more Fed heads saying we got to raise rates. As I said to everyone, making it 100% clear, the higher interest rates go, the stronger the dollar goes and the weaker gold gets. This isn't rocket science. But when they pause rate hikes and then they start lowering them, the dollar is going to go down and gold's going to go up. And oil prices are down. They're in the still Brent crude's in the $75 a barrel plus range. So that's low. So we're looking at recession coming soon. It's happened already. Again, you look at the Target, you look at the Home Depot, and you. So the Dow was up today nearly. You ready? This is why the Dow went up 1%, or the S&P rather. The S&P now is heading toward 8% up for the year. Remember what we told you. After the midterm elections in America in November of 2022, we said following the last 40 midterm elections, the S&P 500 has gone up over 16%. So history is repeating itself. So as trend forecasters, you look at the facts too. This 40 years is a hell of a track record. I'm not going to vote against it or bet against it. And again, the game's rigged. The Dow Jones is up over 115 points. The NASDAQ, again, booming up 1.5%. And when you're looking at what's going on and why the markets went up, they're saying because Biden, the Democrats, and the Republicans can make a deal on the debt ceiling. That's bringing the markets up. That's nothing more than... It has nothing fucking to do with the markets. Total bullshit, fear and hysteria. But that's what they sell. Okay, record buyback spree attracts growing investor complaints. Yep. So the bigs are buying back their stocks and artificially propping them up. And the last time that happened was when Biden gave the tax cuts to the bigs, and they sold the bullshit that they were going to put into capital investment. No, they weren't. They got more money and they bought back their stocks, and it drives the prices back up. San Francisco fire sale. Downtown high rises selling. The $67 million figure marks a 70% decrease from 2020. Talking about the buildings that are being sold. We warned about this. The first magazine, nobody, anytime, has been saying this. And now we said, okay, this is the year they're going to realize it. And again, Trends Journal subscribers know this. We forecast this back in March of 2020 when the scumbag, arrogant pieces of political shit locked down the country. And the geeks were the ones that did it first. So San Francisco is going down hard. And by the way, when I say the scumbag, arrogant, political pieces of shit, tomorrow you could get it. Hey, politicians, who the hell are you to tell me what to do? You go to your Trends Journal site, tomorrow it'll go up, and you see shop, and you can get them. And here's the back of this shirt. All right? You got it? Arrogant, arrogant, arrogant fucks. Lock down the fucking country. The damage it's done is incalculable. Financially, mentally, morally.
The creator originates, the parasite borrows. The creator faces nature alone. The parasite faces nature through an intermediary. The creator's concern is the conquest of nature. The parasite's concern is the conquest of men. The creator lives for his work. He needs no other men. His primary goal is within himself. The parasite lives second-hand. He needs others. Others become his prime motive. The basic need of the creator is independence. The reasoning mind cannot work under any form of compulsion. It cannot be curbed, sacrificed, or subordinated to any consideration whatsoever. It demands total independence in function and in motive.
Chris, we want to go ahead and talk about this inflation. I'm disturbed by the reports from government and the deceptions that go on. The one article that caught my attention this week that you and I have talked a little bit about, it came from Mish Talks. It says retail sales rise in April, but price inflation accounts for all of the increase. But a lot of times you never see a headline like that. I don't see it. I always look for it because I often wonder, things that said sales are up, but have they separated the two? Sales went up because they had more customers, or did sales go up because they charged more for their products? So you have this idea that the economy is weakening. You may have less sales, and the business may be getting poorer. At the same time, there's more money that came in and say, oh, this looks like a pretty good company. So it's not that easy to figure out. So I've been fascinated with that. But there's more than one thing that distorts just understanding in inflation, because the inflation in the definition from Austrian economics is the increase in the supply of money and credit, and that in a way becomes what happens after that. The secondary effect to this are rising prices. And it's really no more complicated than that. But the last thing the government wants you to concentrate on and find out why the prices are going up, because if the people knew, they would say, well, we don't need more cash from the government. We don't need to do this and that. And we need to deal with it eventually by dealing with the printing of money, which means deficit. Oh, well, they're concerned about deficits, aren't they? Not really, because deficits, right now there's a big debate going on raising the debt limit. The debt limit is going to be raised. And then they threaten the people and they say, if we don't raise the debt limit, they'll default. They won't send you your check. That is not true. They always send the check. There's been a few occasions that a few agencies got closed down for a couple hours, but they always pay for it. It's all a political gamesmanship that they're playing. It looks like they're coming to an end of some type of agreement, and they say, and the people who warn you, well, God, we just saved the default. Well, if they knew and understood what spending does, and what default how default can be understood in a little different manners, because defaulting is going on constantly. Governments will never stop sending checks once they gain power to write checks with nothing behind it, print money without anything defending the value of the dollar. That's why 1971 was so important. They declared bankruptcy, and they said we can't honor our commitment. We're bankrupt. We don't have the gold in the bank that would ever meet up with all the money we created. So we're going to default by just giving you out money that has less value. So if we have a debt of $10 billion, we double the money supply, and in real terms, it's only $5 billion. So it's the dilution. But the big problem with this is that you don't know who will be the real victims. Usually it's the middle class and the poor that get hit with higher prices. But instead there has to be a lot of distortion, and there has to be a lot of gimmicks, taxes being manipulated, all these things. But it's always directed to deceiving the people so that they'll go along with it until it gets so bad, then the people revolt against it. And I think we're getting close to that time, Chris, where something like that just may well happen.
Doesn't have to be parasitic, but today it is. That's how you keep it going. So they need lies and deceptions, and we just want to help people to help see through those lies.
Most people see the inflation as rising prices. And that is a consequence. It doesn't affect everybody equally, and it's a distraction from what causes inflation. And that is governments spend money, and the money they don't have. They try to make up for it with taxation. They can't do it. So they devise a system which is a destruction of money. They just print more money, and guess what? When the value goes down, prices go up. So that's been used for a long time. But then the people get nervous and worried about it, and they say, and the politicians have to respond. Some in the past, on several occasions in our history, they resort to wage and price controls because they'll blame labor unions and say, "Oh, you're pushing labor up too fast," and they might be just trying to compensate for the devaluation of their dollar. So they can regulate wages, and also they put on price controls, which makes everything worse. And then of course they try to spend money to help people out who are suffering from higher prices, and they did it immediately. After the COVID epidemic was orchestrated, they sent checks out. Trillions of dollars, and they wanted to take care of it, but they said, well, maybe it'll cause a little inflation, but it's no big deal. But then the other solution that they come up with is Congress needs to hold hearings on that. If we need people to understand what's going on, what they're doing, and they'll have holdings to try to distort the understanding of inflation. They're not going to have hearings and say, you know what? None of this could happen if you didn't have a Federal Reserve. Get rid of the Federal Reserve. They can't run up deficits, and you will have a sound economy and a sound monetary system. That's not going to happen. And then they, because they actually have a committee, and it's called the Oversight Committee. So when you get into trouble, oh, we have an oversight committee. What do we do? And then they come up with a law that says, oh, we have to punish people, and we have to watch it. So we have to watch for people who fraud and abuse, and if we just do that, if we just control that, we're going to save a lot of money, and that's the way to do it. That is not the case. Everything government does is fraudulent and abusive and deceitful and built on lies. So they'll do that, and they go through this gimmickry because they cannot lay the blame on the Federal Reserve, even though there's talk about it, but really putting the blame on the Federal Reserve and wanting to do something about it, they would have had the challenge of what the founders had, because they had runaway inflation, during the revolutionary period with the continental money. It went to zero value. So they put in the Constitution, no central bank, and only gold and silver can be legal tender. Well, that's long been lost, and systematically over 100 years, it brought us to this point. So we'll hear a lot of stuff going around about what we can do and all the gimmickry, and end up getting these reports out. That if you're reporting inflation, you can say, well, sales are up. Prices are up. That's good. There's economic growth, which is just another distortion. So you have to be careful when the government speaks and sends out a report. You have to be a little suspicious what's up their sleeve, because usually there's a gimmick behind what they're doing. Chris?
Absolutely, Dr. Paul. Yes, and I wanted to cover the next thing that was pretty shocking to us. That we heard that the interest on the national debt is now more than national defense, the biggest discretionary spending of all, the big military-industrial complex. Now, interest on the debt is greater than that, which is astonishing. And we have to qualify this. It's not national defense. The actual national defense would cost a fraction of what we spend every single year. What it is empire. The cost of the empire is now less. It's the interest on the debt is now more, which is astonishing. And, there is a silver lining to the Fed raising rates. We talk about all the, there's this push for war, this suicidal, push against nuclear powers like Russia and China. Well, the Fed is making it more expensive. Look at how the interest on the debt is increasing. So that's a good side effect, if you ask me, because, you need a ton of money to fight war, especially world war. And now our empire is so stretched thin that just paying interest on debt is more than the so-called national defense. So it's the same old story. Empires always stretch themselves too thin. This is a big human flaw that goes all the way back. This idea that a certain group of people can dominate the entire world, it has never been done. It most likely will never be done because it's much too expensive. And then you have human nature. Nobody wants to be ruled. So you're always going to have someone else that's going to go up against you. So our empire is definitely stretched too thin, and the interest on the debt is piling up quickly. I'll finish up by saying, it's illegal for all of us to counterfeit, and rightfully so. If any of us had the ability to counterfeit money, it would destroy us as a person. It would destroy all your values eventually. Now, it's also illegal, unconstitutional for the government to counterfeit. But they found a way around it, a loophole. They created a bank that will do it on their behalf, the Federal Reserve. And as can be expected, it has destroyed the concept of government. They've destroyed the money. It should be illegal for everyone to counterfeit, us and them, but they do it, and it is destroying them. We have a group of people over there in DC that are addicted to power and money. That's what they're there for. There's not going to come a time where you're going to turn on the TV and see the Treasury Secretary say, you know what, we've gone too far. We're going to stop. We're going to stop this spending. They're not going to do it voluntarily because that's what they live for. That's how they gain their power. They have people that virtually worship them because of this. So look at the great that I'm doing for you with this printed money. So, and they always will claim that it's a crisis if they stop. And that's what Janet Yellen is doing today. If they don't raise this debt ceiling, it's going to be a crisis. If they don't keep going broke, there's going to be a crisis for us. That's what they're basically saying. The real crisis is the opposite. Them continuing on this path is the crisis. And while they will not voluntarily stop, they will come to a point where they will have to stop because they will have no other choice. And whether it's because other countries are dumping the dollar, there's just too many variables in play to say what will cause that, but they will have to stop because they have no other choice. And that is going to be a big crisis to take it to that extreme. So we'll see what happens, but what they are doing is only digging the hole.
A lot of people say, you guys want too much liberty, and it's dangerous because people might not do what they should do, work hard and save their money and take care of themselves in old age, which is true. It could happen, but there would be the incentive factor that most people would take advantage of the fact that they don't have to pay income taxes to the government, and they may have an incentive, to invest in things. Today, there's no incentive to put money in a bank. You can't even make enough interest to keep up, with the inflation rate. So we do the opposite. We discourage the people to take care of themselves, and I frequently refer to the Bastiat principle, which teaches that you can solve the problem by prohibiting the government from doing anything that you have, the people have been technically not able to do. You can't do it. It's illegal to do it, like stealing. But there was one issue that the government wanted to make it very, very clear, that there was not to be counterfeiting and counterfeiting of money. They were really hacked off about the destruction of the currency. It was made in 1792 with one of the first monetary control acts. They said that the penalty for counterfeiting money would be death. That's how serious they thought about it. And they were libertarian. They weren't looking for a lot of federal laws. But for them, the money issue was a big issue. And yet, it's still, don't mess with the currency. Somebody made a coin when I was campaigning, and it was a significant coin, and they had the audacity to put my picture on it, which made me a little bit annoyed. But they had the coin, and they called it $1, I think. They put the word dollar on it. Boy, I'll tell you what, boom, the feds came down tough on there. Don't mess with that, as if that was going to get circulated or something. But in a free society, because if you did that and you had a coin at the state level, that's why I like what the states are doing with this issue. There are states that are making it legal to buy gold and silver coins and mint gold and silver coins, because the Constitution is very clear that the states are directed. You can't use anything other than silver and gold as a legal tender. So it's not that complicated, and I think that people will realize. Even now, Zimbabwe has talked about trying to issue certificates that were backed by gold. They've learned their lesson. Sometimes they want to go in a different direction, and history is on the side of saying that the precious metals were first of money, and it's lasted for thousands of years. And there will be a prohibition. That was what did Roosevelt do? First week in office, bring me the gold. You guys aren't going to protect yourself against what we have planned, because we plan to print a lot of money. So for 40 years, Americans weren't even allowed to own gold. That's how determined they are with that. So that is why one thing we have to continue to think about: what are they going to do this go around when there's runaway inflation and people are benefiting and with the protection of gold? And quite frankly, my opinion is that I don't think they'll try to confiscate it like they did in the 30s. But they may meddle. And the way that our governments over the years have meddled in what people try to do for themselves is what they do is they tax. So they might say, oh, you want to cash in and you want to spend your gold eagle. Oh, okay, well, this is what the tax would be on there. That's not a gold standard. Anyway, be careful when you hear the government reports, because their job is to try to, project deception. They're probably trying to lead you. They can lead us into false assumptions economically. They lead us by false assumptions and scaring the people into war. So there's no reason to blindly accept everything the government tells us, but there's no reason to accept that it has to be that way. Chris started his statement off today by saying that libertarians believe in non-violence and bringing about changes, and that's what we tried real hard to do on the Liberty Report. Persuade people to change their habits and to accept this very, very special notion, individual liberty can solve most of our problems.
To a creator, all relations with men are secondary. The basic need of the second-hander is to secure his ties with men in order to be fed. He places relations first. He declares that man exists in order to serve others. He preaches altruism. Altruism is the doctrine which demands that man live for others and place others above self. No man can live for another. He cannot share his spirit, just as he cannot share his body. But the second-hander has used altruism as a weapon of exploitation and reversed the base of mankind's moral principles. Men have been taught every precept that destroys the Creator. Men have been taught dependence as a virtue. The man who attempts to live for others is a dependent. He is a parasite in motive and makes parasites of those he serves. The relationship produces nothing but mutual corruption. It is impossible in concept. The nearest approach to it in reality, the man who lives to serve others, is the slave. If physical slavery is repulsive, how much more repulsive is the concept of servility of the spirit? The conquered slave has a vestige of honor. He has the merit of having resisted and of considering his condition evil. But the man who enslaves himself voluntarily in the name of love is the basest of creatures. He degrades the dignity of man, and he degrades the conception of love. But this is the essence of altruism.
This is ever going to end. All right, the next one here, NATO to draw up Russia war plans for the first time since the Cold War. So NATO is drawing up plans on how to fight a war with Russia for the first time since the Cold War. And at the upcoming NATO summit in Vilnius this July, alliance leaders will approve thousands of pages of secret military plans that will detail how to respond to a Russian attack. And these plans will be vastly different than anything drawn up during the Cold War, as NATO has expanded from 16 members to 31 since the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. The documents will also outline how NATO members should upgrade their forces and logistics. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said, quote, allies will know exactly what forces and capabilities are needed, including where, what, and how to deploy, end quote. So NATO's newest member, which is Finland, shares an over 800-mile border with Russia and is poised to sign a deal that will give U.S. troops access to its territory. And while the alliance is preparing to beef up its presence on its eastern flank, one NATO official acknowledged the danger of massing troops near Russia's border. So I thought this was an interesting quote. This is from a NATO Lieutenant General Hubert Kotere. I probably butchered his name there. He's the vice chief of staff for NATO's supreme headquarters, allied powers in Europe. And he told this to Reuters, quote, the more troops you are massing up on the border, it's like having a hammer. At some point, you want to find a nail. If the Russians are massing troops on the border, that will make us nervous. If we are massing troops on the border, that will make them nervous, end quote. So at least acknowledging that expanding NATO onto Russia's border is, makes the Russians nervous. As much as they want to say this war was unprovoked, at least there's some acknowledgement there of, we're just going down such a dangerous path here. And, this is just more preparation for war with Russia. And they're saying this would be based on some sort of Russian attack. I don't think Russia has shown any indication that it wants to attack NATO, especially after all of the escalations of NATO involvement in the war in Ukraine. But, you never know what could happen with, you have these Russian and NATO aircraft always encountering each other now. Another missile could end up hitting Poland or something. You just never know what could happen. We could wake up one morning and, it could be at war with Russia. I think it is. We are on that much of the edge here.
Men have been taught that the highest virtue is not to achieve, but to give. Yet one cannot give that which has not been created. Creation comes before distribution, or there will be nothing to distribute. The need of the Creator comes before the need of any possible beneficiary. Yet we are taught to admire the second-hander who dispenses gifts he has not produced, above the man who made the gifts possible. We praise an act of charity, we shrug at an act of achievement.
Right into it there. But yeah, look, for folks who are hearing from me for the first time, I'm 37 years old. I'm a millennial. I'm the first millennial ever to run for U.S. president as a Republican. And I'm doing it not as a politician, but as somebody who has lived the full arc of the American dream. My parents came to this country with almost no money about 40 years ago. I've gone on to found multi-billion-dollar companies, including a biotech company where I served as CEO for 7 years, oversaw the development of a number of medicines. 5 are FDA-approved products today, and that's one of several successful companies that I've built. I stepped down from my job as a CEO to speak my mind freely as a citizen, which, funny enough as it sounds, I wasn't really free to do as the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar biotech company. In the wake of George Floyd's death and the demand that I make a statement on behalf of Black Lives Matter and take a number of other positions, that woke me up to write the book that I ended up writing, Woke Inc., Inside Corporate America's Social Justice Scam. The emphasis was more on the ink than on the woke, actually criticizing corporations using social and political values to effectively do the work of the state in return for keeping the state at bay, sort of an arranged marriage between a neo-progressive woke left and consolidated post-2008, post-bailout Wall Street and Silicon Valley that created a new Leviathan far more powerful than what Thomas Hobbes envisioned 400 years ago. And so I've since been on something of a crusade for the last several years against the rise of ESG in capital markets, where under the myth that it's actually the invisible hand of the free market, what I've actually exposed through my work, through Woke Inc., through Capitalist Punishment, a subsequent book that I wrote, and through actually starting a business called Strive that now competes against BlackRock in the market. What I exposed was that the rise of the ESG movement in capital markets was not actually the work of the invisible hand of the free market at all. It was the invisible fist of government lurking behind the scenes, where pension funds like those at CalPERS or in the state of New York were effectively co-opting financial institutions, saying they wouldn't do business with them unless those financial institutions and asset managers used all of the money they managed to vote in favor of social and political agendas, racial equity audits, emissions caps, et cetera, in corporate boardrooms that most Americans don't agree with, and more importantly, which don't advance the best financial interests of their clients. And so that's what I had been doing for the last several years. But what led me to run for president was my honest reflection that as much as there is a top-down problem in the rise of this ESG industrial complex, what I call the woke industrial complex sometimes, while there is a top-down problem, the merger of state and corporate power to delegate to the other what either couldn't do on its own, that trick only works if there is a culture willing to buy up what they're actually selling. And I think that that's something that I wasn't going to address just through writing books, through top-down action, even through the market alone, but by leading a cultural revival, if you will, on the demand side that addresses a hunger for purpose and meaning in my generation that I think we have not addressed in this country in a very long time. Graham or Mitt Romney, let's say, I would not ask you the following question, but you're not. You're a bright young guy who is well-read and knowledgeable. So I am going to ask you this. Who would you describe as your major influences, let's say, philosophically?
I think Friedrich von Hayek is probably pretty darn close to the top of the list. I think that his argument in the Constitution of Liberty, I think, is a powerful one that makes a case for what we can in a reductive form call free market capitalism. I mean, that's overly reductive, but his pro-market theory is grounded not in some utilitarian account, and not even just in the ontological account of individual freedom as it relates to the person whose wealth or market freedoms are not interfered with. That's only part of the story, but also grounded in a theory of human respect that I think we've forgotten, where I think the basic case that he makes against, for example, government-ordained redistribution and equity-oriented programs is that it actually disrespects every human being, because by falsely conflating your moral worth with the number of green pieces of paper you control, you reinforce the assumption that actually results in the loss of civic respect for people who don't have as many of those green pieces of paper. And I think that that's part of the logic that was probably most persuasive to me in offering a yang to Milton Friedman's yin in my critique against stakeholder capitalism and ESG was not simply that it posed a threat to capitalism from the overexpansionary force of politics, but rather the reverse, that actually when capitalists wield too much political power through the market itself, it actually sucks the lifeblood out of a constitutional republic or out of a democratic society where every person's voice and vote counts equally. And so over the last 3 years, I've been sort of aiming certainly to bring Milton Friedman's famous 1970 thesis into the 21st century, but by making the inverse of the case that he made to complete his unfinished work. But since you're asking me to pause and ask where that came from, probably the roots of it start with Hayek and the constitutional liberty. Trump identified the administrative state as a problem. The reality is he didn't do much to address it, not in a permanent way at least. I mean, take the Department of Education. I'll just use this as an example. This is an agency that spends $90 billion a year that in my book should not exist. It has no reason for existence. And Trump put a fine enough person, Betsy DeVos, on top of it to run it. But tinkering around the edges doesn't solve the problem. I think there's exactly one answer. When you have an administrative agency that should not exist, you shut it down, period. That is the answer. That's what I've committed to do as the next president. I think that involves getting into the details of your constitutional and statutory authority to actually do it. We can talk about the mechanics of how I would make that happen. But I've identified a list of agencies. I mean, I think the FBI should not exist. At the local level, you have a police, you have a prosecutor, you don't have an intermediary agency. At the federal level, you have U.S. Marshals and you have the Department of Justice. But when you have an entire intermediary bureaucracy, that is a formula, a cesspool,
for managerial corruption, for overreach, for abuse of power. Well, guess what you get? You get abuse of power, and this is not a partisan issue. The same J. Edgar Hoover FBI that tried to threaten Martin Luther King Jr. into committing suicide, that now goes after its political opponents in a very different way today. Yet the whole point is that that agency should not exist if we're actually running this the right way. And I think you can both restore not only budgetary discipline, that's less what motivates me, although it's a nice side benefit, but you can restore budgetary discipline with also, most importantly, restoring a 3-branch system of government, an actual constitutional republic ordained in our Constitution, rather than this unconstitutional 4th branch that performs most of government's functions today. And so that's an example of where I differ a little bit from Donald Trump. I think there's a lot that he could have done by rescinding bad executive orders from the past. Government interference in the market. You want to talk about affirmative action. Lyndon Johnson signed into law, or signed into an executive order, really a regulation, that mandated, it was Executive Order 11246, that mandated anyone who does business with the government to adopt race-based quota systems. I reject that vision. I would rescind that order on day one. It's one of the easiest things the next president can do. It's interference in the private market via social mandate that comes through a condition of doing business with the federal government. Well, Trump could have done it. He didn't do it. I actually pushed his people on why. They said that it was a political hill they didn't want to die on. And so I bring up these two examples. They're just examples. I think they're symptoms of a deeper approach to how I would govern that's a little bit different than Trump. This from the standpoint of somebody who, by the way, admires a lot of what he did, especially as an outsider to the system. When you're doing it based on vengeance and grievance, you can go so far. But you can go far further if you're grounded in first principles and moral authority. And that's what I'm bringing to the table that I think is a little bit different than Trump. I think that's what will allow me to take much of that same agenda to the next level and to do it in a way that I think actually unites the country, as Reagan did in the 1980s. That's what I think we can deliver in 2024. Climate and on. I saw you speak numerous times about Silicon Valley Bank, and you were willing to stake out a position that in some circles would make you unpopular, and you just did it anyway. But I haven't, and this is probably my fault, but I haven't heard you talk about your opinions on, I can guess them, but I'd love to hear you describe them, on the public health establishment in the U.S., especially after COVID.
Hmm.
The biosecurity state that we have inherited. I think it is just another example of the rise of this managerial class that wields power that nobody vested in them through elections in this country. And that's back to the same thing I was saying about the Department of Education or the FBI. So it goes for the CDC and the Anthony Fauci religion that pervades the NIH and much of the national health policy establishment, which is, it's a symptom of a deeper distrust of citizens, actually. And we sorted this out, or we thought we sorted this out in 1776 in this country, where the American bargain was that we, the people, the citizens, decide how we will govern ourselves rather than bending the knee to some autocratic monarchy. And the old world European view, and by the way, for most of human history, it was done that way. The view was that people cannot be trusted to self-govern, that they will lead themselves into existential traps and they don't know what's best for them. And so it requires an enlightened group of elites, business leaders, labor leaders, church leaders, get together in the back of palace halls, decide what's right for the rest of society at large. Well, that old monster is now rearing its head again in the modern American moment that is fundamentally skeptical of self-governance. They don't say it in so many words, but that's really what it's about, is a belief that if people are left to govern themselves, then we won't have an habitable planet left to live on due to the existential threat of global climate change, that we would die as a consequence of epidemics like that raging across the country and the world, like that of COVID-19, ignoring the fact that that same bureaucratic class we now know was responsible for creating COVID-19 in a virus that was engineered in a lab in Wuhan, funded by U.S. resources against and outside of the contours of a ban on that very form of gain-of-function research. So put aside the merits, which I think fail on their own terms, but just on normative grounds, even if the merits were supportive of some sort of marginal public health benefit at the expense of giving up on self-governance, and by the way, the facts don't even support that that was beneficial, the facts support the opposite. But even if it were, the American way is that for better or worse, we are the quintessential place, not only on the planet, but in human history, that embraces self-governance over aristocracy. And I think that one of the places we saw that aristocracy rear its head was in the rise of the post-COVID or intra-COVID biosecurity state that was temporarily established in this country. And I think more of us need to be unapologetic in talking about it, because if you don't learn from your mistakes as a country, you're going to keep making them again and again. To me, that was the biggest disappointment of the midterms. I felt like the entire class of people who were responsible for what was done to us needed to be overwhelmingly repudiated, and we did not get that satisfaction.
Well, I think a lot of the lockdowns took place under President Trump in year one of the pandemic. And so I think that was part of the reason why Republicans were unable to fully own that message. Same thing as it related to government spending and inflation, by the way, is I think that we have to be on firm footing in practicing what we preach. And this isn't blaming Trump or anything. This is just acknowledging fact. I think it became very uncomfortable for Republicans to stand on solid footing when it comes to reining in government size spending, COVID lockdowns, when a lot of that happened on our own watch. And so I just believe in first principles rather than towing some partisan line. So, I'll offend some people in my own party along the way, but that's what it's going to take to speak truth. And more importantly, that's what it's going to take to revive our national identity, which is what I'm trying to lead.
What's your website?
It is Vivek2024.com, VIVEK 2024.com.
Men have been taught that their first concern is to relieve the suffering of others, but suffering is a disease. Should one come upon it, one tries to give relief and assistance. To make that the highest test of virtue is to make suffering the most important part of life. Then man must wish to see others suffer in order that he may be virtuous. Such is the nature of altruism. The Creator is not concerned with disease, but with life. Yet the work of the creators has eliminated one form of disease after another in man's body and spirit, and brought more relief from suffering than any altruist could ever conceive. Men have been taught that it is a virtue to agree with others, but the Creator is the man who disagrees. Men have been taught that it is a virtue to swim with the current, but the Creator is the man who goes against the current. Men have been taught that it is a virtue to stand together, but the Creator is the man who stands alone. Men have been taught that the ego is the synonym of evil, and selflessness the ideal of virtue, but the Creator is the egotist in the absolute sense, and the selfless man is the one who does not think, feel, judge, or act. These are functions of the self. Here, the basic reversal is most deadly. The issue has been perverted, and man has been left no alternative and no freedom. As poles of good and evil, he was offered two conceptions, egotism and altruism. Egotism was held to mean the sacrifice of others to self, altruism, the sacrifice of self to others. This tied man irrevocably to other men, and left him nothing but a choice of pain, his own pain, borne for the sake of others, or pain inflicted upon others for the sake of self. When it was added that man must find joy in self-immolation, the trap was closed. Man was forced to accept masochism as his ideal, under the threat that sadism was his only alternative. This was the greatest fraud ever perpetrated on mankind. This was the device by which dependence and suffering were perpetuated as fundamentals of life. The choice is not self-sacrifice or domination. The choice is independence or dependence. The code of the Creator or the code of the second-hander. This is the basic issue. It rests upon the alternative of life or death. The code of the Creator is built on the needs of the reasoning mind, which allows man to survive. The code of the second-hander is built on the needs of a mind incapable of survival. All that which proceeds from man's independent ego is good. All that which proceeds from man's dependence upon men is evil. The egotist, in the absolute sense, is not the man who sacrifices others. He is the man who stands above the need of using others in any manner. He does not function through them. He is not concerned with them in any primary manner. Not in his aim, not in his motive, not in his thinking, not in his desires, not in the sources of his energy. He does not exist for any other man, and he asks no other man to exist for him. This is the only form of brotherhood and mutual respect possible between men. Degrees of ability vary, but the basic principle remains the same. The degree of a man's independence, initiative, and personal love for his work determines his talent as a worker and his worth as a man. Independence is the only gauge of human virtue and value. What a man is and makes of himself, not what he has or hasn't done for others. There is no substitute for personal dignity. There is no standard of personal dignity except independence. In all proper relationships, there is no sacrifice of anyone to anyone. An architect needs clients, but he does not subordinate his work to their wishes. They need him, but they do not order a house just to give him a commission. Men exchange their work by free mutual consent to mutual advantage, when their personal interests agree and they both desire the exchange. If they do not desire it, they are not forced to deal with each other. They seek further. This is the only possible form of relationship between equals. Anything else is a relation of slave to master or victim to executioner. No work is ever done collectively by a majority decision. Every creative job is achieved under the guidance of a single individual thought. An architect requires a great many men to erect his building, but he does not ask them to vote on his design. They work together by free agreement, and each is free in his proper function. An architect uses steel, glass, concrete, produced by others, but the materials remain just so much steel, glass, and concrete until he touches them. What he does with them is his individual product and his individual property. This is the only pattern for proper cooperation among men. The first right on earth is the right of the ego. Man's first duty is to himself. His moral law is never to place his prime goal within the persons of others. His moral obligation is to do what he wishes, provided his wish does not depend primarily upon other men. This includes the whole sphere of his creative faculty, his thinking, his work. But it does not include the sphere of the gangster, the altruist, and the dictator. A man thinks and works alone. A man cannot rob, exploit, or rule alone. Robbery, exploitation, and ruling presuppose victims. They imply dependence. They are the province of the second-hander. Rulers of men are not egotists. They create nothing. They exist entirely through the persons of others. Their goal is in their subjects, in the activity of enslaving. They are as dependent as the beggar, the social worker, and the bandit. The form of dependence does not matter. But men were taught to regard second-handers, tyrants, emperors, dictators, as exponents of egotism. By this fraud, they were made to destroy the ego, themselves, and others. The purpose of the fraud was to destroy the creators, or to harness them, which is a synonym. From the beginning of history, the two antagonists have stood face to face, the creator and the second-hander. When the first creator invented the wheel, the first second-hander responded. He invented altruism. The creator denied, opposed, persecuted, exploited, went on, moved forward, and carried all humanity along on his energy. The second-hander contributed nothing to the process, except the impediments. The contest has another name: the individual against the collective. The common good of a collective, a race, a class, a state, was the claim and justification of every tyranny ever established over men. Every major horror of history was committed in the name of an altruistic motive. Has any act of selfishness ever equaled the carnage perpetrated by disciples of altruism? Does the fault lie in men's hypocrisy, or in the nature of the principle? The most dreadful butchers were the most sincere. They believed in the perfect society reached through the guillotine and the firing squad. Nobody questioned their right to murder, since they were murdering for an altruistic purpose. It was accepted that man must be sacrificed for other men. Actors change, but the course of the tragedy remains the same. A humanitarian who starts with declarations of love for mankind and ends with a sea of blood. It goes on and will go on, so long as men believe that an action is good if it is unselfish. That permits the altruist to act and forces his victims to bear it. The leaders of collectivist movements ask nothing for themselves, but observe the results. The only good which men can do to one another, and the only statement of their proper relationship is, hands off. Now, observe the results of a society built on the principle of individualism. This, our country, the noblest country in the history of men, the country of greatest achievement, greatest prosperity, greatest freedom. This country was not based on selfless service, sacrifice, renunciation, or any precept of altruism. It was based on a man's right to the pursuit of happiness, his own happiness, not anyone else's, a private, personal, selfish motive. Look at the results. Look into your own conscience. It is an ancient conflict. Men have come close to the truth, but it was destroyed each time, and one civilization fell after another. Civilization is the progress toward a society of privacy. The savage's whole existence is public, ruled by the laws of his tribe. Civilization is the process of setting man free from men. Now in our age, collectivism, the rule of the second-hander and second-rater, the ancient monster, has broken loose and is running amok. It has brought men to a level of intellectual indecency never equaled on earth. It has reached a scale of horror without precedent. It has poisoned every mind. It has swallowed most of Europe. It is engulfing our country. I am an architect. I know what it is to come by the principle on which it is built. We are approaching a world in which I cannot permit myself to live. Now you know why I dynamited Cortland. I designed Cortland. I gave it to you. I destroyed it. I destroyed it because I did not choose to let it exist. It was a double monster, in form and in implication. I had to blast both. The form was mutilated by two second-handers who assumed the right to improve upon that which they had not made and could not equal. They were permitted to do it by the general implication that the altruistic purpose of the building superseded all rights, and that I had no claim to stand against it. I agreed to design Cortlandt for the purpose of seeing it erected as I designed it, and for no other reason. That was the price I set for my work. I was not paid. I do not blame Peter Keating. He was helpless. He had a contract with his employers. It was ignored. He had a promise that the structure he offered would be built as designed. The promise was broken. The love of a man for the integrity of his work and his right to preserve it are now considered a vague intangible and an inessential. You have heard the prosecutor say that. Why was the building disfigured? For no reason. Such acts never have any reason, unless it's the vanity of some second-handers who feel they have a right to anyone's property, spiritual or material. Who permitted them to do it? No particular man among the dozens in authority. No one cared to permit it or to stop it. No one was responsible. No one can be held to account. Such is the nature of all collective action. I did not receive the payment I asked, but the owners of Cortlandt got what they needed from me. They wanted a scheme devised to build a structure as cheaply as possible. They found no one else who could do it to their satisfaction. I could, and did. They took the benefit of my work and made me contribute it as a gift. But I'm not an altruist. I do not contribute gifts of this nature. It is said that I've destroyed the home of the destitute. It is forgotten that but for me the destitute could not have had this particular home. Those who were concerned with the poor had come to me, who had never been concerned, in order to help the poor. It is believed that the poverty of the future tenants gave them a right to my work, that their need constituted a claim on my life, that it was my duty to contribute anything demanded of me. This is the second-hander's credo now swallowing the world. I came here to say that I do not recognize anyone's right to 1 minute of my life, nor to any part of my energy, nor to any achievement of mine, no matter who makes the claim, how large their number, or how great their need. I wished to come here and say that I am a man who does not exist for others. It had to be said. The world is perishing from an orgy of self-sacrificing. I wished to come here and say that the integrity of a man's creative work is of greater importance than any charitable endeavor. Those of you who do not understand this are the men who are destroying the world. I wished to come here and state my terms. I do not care to exist on any others. I recognize no obligations toward men except one, to respect their freedom and to take no part in a slave society. To my country, I wish to give the 10 years which I will spend in jail if my country exists no longer. I will spend them in memory and in gratitude for what my country has been. It will be my act of loyalty, my refusal to live or work in what has taken its place. My act of loyalty to every creator who ever lived and was made to suffer by the force responsible for the Cortlandt I dynamited. To every tortured hour of loneliness, denial, frustration, abuse he was made to spend. And to the battles he won. To every creator whose name is known, and to every creator who lived, struggled, and perished unrecognized before he could achieve. To every creator who was destroyed in body or in spirit. To Henry Cameron, to Stephen Mallory, to a man who doesn't want to be named, but who is sitting in this courtroom, and knows that I am speaking of him. Rourke stood, his legs apart, his arms straight at his sides, his head lifted, as he stood in an unfinished building. Later, when he was seated again at the defense table, many men in the room felt as if they still saw him standing. One moment's picture that would not be replaced. The picture remained in their minds through the long legal discussions that followed. They heard the judge state to the prosecutor that the defendant had, in effect, changed his plea. He had admitted his act, but had not pleaded guilty of the crime. An issue of temporary legal insanity was raised. It was up to the jury to decide whether the defendant knew the nature and quality of his act, or, if he did, whether he knew that the act was wrong. The prosecutor raised no objection. There was an odd silence in the room. He felt certain that he had won his case already. He made his closing address. No one remembered what he said. The judge gave his instructions to the jury. The jury rose and left the courtroom. People moved, preparing to depart without haste, in expectation of many hours of waiting. Wynand at the back of the room, and Dominique in the front, sat without moving. A bailiff stepped to Rourke's side to escort him out. Rourke stood by the defense table. His eyes went to Dominique, then to Wynand. He turned and followed the bailiff. He had reached the door when there was a sharp crack of sound and a space of blank silence before people realized that it was a knock at the closed door of the jury room. The jury had reached a verdict. Those who had been on their feet remained standing, frozen, until the judge returned to the bench. The jury filed into the courtroom. "The prisoner will rise and face the jury," said the clerk of the court. Howard Rourke stepped forward and stood facing the jury. At the back of the room, Gail Wynand got up and stood also. "Mr. Foreman, have you reached a verdict?" "We have." "What is your verdict?" "Not guilty." The first movement of Rourke's head was not to look at the city in the window, at the judge, or at Dominique. He looked at Wynand. Wynand turned sharply and walked out. He was the first man to leave the courtroom.